Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight, we're not looking up at the stars or out into deep time, but inward, into the quiet code that makes us who we are. There's a question that lingers at the edges of both science and imagination. What if the first civilization didn't vanish, but lives on inside us? Not in monuments or myths, but in our very DNA. The double helix as a kind of biological time capsule, carrying the faint genetic handwriting of beings who came long before what we call history began. Wherever you're listening from, maybe you've felt that strange sense of familiarity with something you've never seen. A landscape that feels known. A pattern in the clouds that seems to speak a forgotten word. Could it be that part of what feels ancient inside us actually is? If you find thoughts like these soothing, or simply a nice way to drift into sleep with a hint of wonder, I'd be grateful if you gave this quiet corner a like, maybe even subscribed. It helps more curious minds find their way here too. Now, take a deep breath, let your shoulders settle, and let's begin. Because somewhere inside every one of us may lie the memory of the first civilization, not written in stone, but beneath our skin. When we think of ancient civilizations, we usually picture ruins, stone cities swallowed by jungles, statues staring into the desert, fragments of pottery half buried in dust. But what if the real ruins aren't out there? What if they're microscopic, invisible and alive within us? Every cell of your body carries DNA, a molecule so densely packed with information that if written out, the code in a single cell could fill hundreds of thick books. And it's not just a record of you, it's the echo of every organism that came before. Each line of that code is a sentence written by evolution, revised and rewritten over billions of years. DNA doesn't forget easily. Mutations, errors, adaptations, they're all part of a continuous story that stretches back to the first self-replicating molecule on Earth. Somewhere in that unbroken thread might be more than just random change. It could hold traces of design, of choices made by something intelligent, something ancient. Not the kind of intelligence we imagine visiting from the stars, but perhaps one that once walked the same ground we do, far earlier than we think. Scientists talk about genetic drift and inheritance, about how every species is a mosaic of old and new code. But there's another kind of inheritance, one that isn't always measured in genes alone. It's the way certain instincts appear before learning, the way we know to fear the dark or to find comfort in the sound of another heartbeat. Maybe these aren't just evolutionary accidents. Maybe they're echoes of memories passed down in molecular form, fragments of what life once was when it first learned how to build itself. Modern genetics has uncovered some startling facts about our own ancestry. We now know that humans carry traces of other species in our genome, the most famous being Neanderthals and Denisovans. Their DNA didn't vanish when they did. Instead, it lives on in us, influencing everything from our immune systems to how we respond to altitude or sunlight. In other words, we are living proof that the past doesn't disappear. It integrates. It survives. It hides in the smallest parts of us, waiting to be found. So if fragments of other hominins are still in us, what else might be? The fossil record is patchy, the ground stingy with clues. Entire species could have risen and vanished without leaving so much as a bone behind. We assume civilization began a few thousand years ago, but the Earth has been stable enough for intelligent life for millions. That's an enormous gap. A gap wide enough to hide more than just forgotten species. It could hide a whole forgotten age. And if such a civilization existed, its monuments might be gone, its cities erased by time, but its most durable artifact could still remain, life itself, modified to carry a message forward. There's an idea whispered occasionally among researchers who study ancient DNA, sometimes half-jokingly, sometimes not. What if our genome has layers, like geological strata? The most recent layers encode the things we know: metabolism, growth, cognition. But deeper down, beneath the layers of adaptation and selection, there might be patterns that no longer serve any function. sequences that don't code for anything we understand. Genetic junk, as it was once called. But junk is a careless word for something we don't yet understand. Over the years, scientists have realised that many of these so-called useless regions actually play subtle roles, regulating other genes, shaping when and how they activate, influencing development in ways we're only beginning to uncover. If a civilization from deep prehistory had the knowledge to alter life, those non-coding regions might be the perfect place to hide something. A pattern, a signature, perhaps even a message. Not a literal language in the way we read words, but information structured deliberately. Something that doesn't fit randomness. And here's the curious thing. Some researchers have already found patterns in DNA that seem oddly ordered, almost linguistic. They could be coincidences, artifacts of how evolution organises information, or they could be something else entirely. Imagine a species millions of years before us, reaching a peak of knowledge. They understand biology not as we do, through tools and microscopes, but intuitively, directly. They see DNA not as a mystery, but as clay, as something that can be moulded and inscribed. Knowing that extinction is inevitable, they decide to leave behind not monuments, but instructions, woven into the biology of the planet itself. Over time, their cities crumble, their machines dissolve, their names vanish. But the code remains, replicated endlessly, carried forward through eons of evolution. One day, another species, us, appears. We sequence our DNA, staring into the same spiral of life they once shaped, never realizing that the architects might still be whispering through it. The idea sounds fantastical, even mystical, but it doesn't require belief in anything supernatural. It's just an extension of what life already does. DNA is a memory system. It stores, copies, and transmits information across time. Once, that information only concerned survival. But if intelligence evolved earlier than we think, it could have learned to use DNA deliberately, to shape descendants, to pass on knowledge at a level no artifact could match. We already do this ourselves. In labs around the world, scientists encode text, images, even digital files into strands of synthetic DNA. A single gram of DNA can store hundreds of terabytes of data. It's stable for thousands of years, nature's ultimate hard drive, right inside us. So if we can do it now, in the infancy of our understanding, why couldn't someone else have done it long before us? That's the unsettling thought. Maybe we're not the first to play with the code of life. Maybe we're the result. Of course, this idea sits at the edge of science, where evidence thins and imagination takes over. There's no direct proof of an ancient civilization modifying DNA, but the search itself is part of what makes it compelling, because every time we decode a new genome, every time we find a new sequence that doesn't fit the pattern, we're glimpsing the possibility that our species isn't just the product of evolution, but of legacy. Consider how little we've actually looked. Less than a century ago, we didn't even know what DNA was. Now we can read it, but reading isn't the same as understanding. The genome is vast, over 3 billion base pairs, and much of it remains a mystery. Some of that mystery may simply be the complexity of life, but perhaps part of it is deliberate complexity, the kind you'd expect from something designed to last. There's a strange comfort in the idea that somewhere deep inside we're carrying not just our ancestors' genes, but their intentions, that the drive to explore, to create, to build isn't new, but inherited. Maybe curiosity itself is the oldest message of all, passed down from minds we'll never know, embedded in the code that keeps us alive. When you look at the double helix, that elegant twist of information, you're looking at something that hasn't broken in 4 billion years. Every living thing on this planet shares it, from trees to whales to us. It's the one unbroken chain connecting every era of life, and within that chain are repeating motifs, recurring sequences, patterns that seem to echo themselves across species, across epochs. They're not random. They're reminders that life remembers, even when we don't. So when we talk about the possibility of a first civilization leaving their DNA in us, it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. Because something already did. Life itself did. Evolution is the longest story ever told, and we are its latest sentence. The question is whether some earlier storyteller might have edited a few of the lines before passing the book along. Somewhere in your body right now, there are billions of cells quietly copying ancient instructions. Most of them were written long before your species existed. They tell the cells how to grow, how to divide, how to die, how to remember what they are. And when they do that, they're echoing the same chemical logic that guided the first living things. It's easy to think of that as automatic, as purely mechanical. But if you look closely enough, it starts to feel almost intentional. The precision, the resilience, the way the same motifs appear over and over, as if whoever wrote the code wanted to make sure it wouldn't be forgotten. We often assume that intelligence is rare, that civilizations are fragile, that once they're gone forever. But if a species wanted to outlast extinction, altering DNA would be the most efficient way to do it. Not just to leave a mark, but to become the mark. They wouldn't need pyramids or satellites, they'd need bacteria, something that can survive in ice, in rock, in space, something that can replicate for billions of years without help, the perfect messenger. So perhaps the oldest civilization didn't vanish, it adapted, it distributed itself into the blueprint of life and let evolution do the rest. What we call natural selection could be their legacy unfolding, a self-sustaining mechanism designed to keep the experiment running until it reached consciousness again, until it reached us. And maybe, as we sequence more genomes, we'll begin to see patterns we can't explain. Not divine signatures or alien fingerprints, but the subtle order of minds who learn to speak in chemistry instead of language. Minds that didn't die, but translated themselves into the only medium that never forgets. If that's true, then we are both the descendants and the continuation of that first civilization. We are their experiment still unfolding, their thought still processing, their memory still alive. And the quiet code inside every one of us might just be humming the same tune they once heard when they realized they could shape the world. So as you sit here now, listening, breathing, your body's performing millions of chemical reactions every second, all guided by that ancient script. You are, in every literal sense, a living fossil. Not one buried in stone, but one that walks, thinks, wonders. Maybe that's what they intended. Maybe curiosity was the switch they left on so that one day their descendants would start asking questions like this. And as those questions echo softly in your thoughts, let's move a little deeper. Let's follow that thread further back, past recorded history, past the first cities, past the ice, into the long silence before civilization began. Because if we want to know whether the first civilization left their DNA in us, we need to find out who might have come before us at all. It's easy to forget that the most important museum in the world isn't built of stone or glass, it's inside you. Every strand of your DNA is a record of survival, a timeline so old that it began long before any creature had eyes to see. You carry the entire history of life on Earth inside every cell of your body. But you also carry mysteries. Within that microscopic spiral are traces of other beings, other versions of humanity, and perhaps other species that no longer exist in memory or record. That's what makes our genome not just a biological document, but a whispering archive. It remembers things that history forgot. The story of that discovery begins with curiosity, the same kind that drives us now. When scientists first sequenced the human genome, they expected a clear pattern, something neat, elegant, mathematical. Instead, they found chaos, vast stretches of code that seemed to do nothing, sequences that repeated endlessly, fragments copied and pasted for reasons no one understood. It looked to some like a library that had been rewritten too many times. Some pages made sense, Others were covered in scribbles, marginal notes and missing paragraphs. And among all that noise, a strange question began to form. What if this wasn't noise at all? What if it was something left behind? To understand the whisper in our genes, we first have to understand how that code speaks. DNA isn't mystical. It's chemistry. 4 simple bases, adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine, arranged in different sequences like letters forming words. Those words tell the cell what proteins to build, when to build them, and how to interact with other cells. It's a simple language that, when combined in billions of ways, creates everything from oak trees to blue whales to you. The astonishing part is that the alphabet never changes. Every living thing on Earth uses the same 4 letters, the same grammar, the same syntax. That uniformity is what allows scientists to trace evolution backward, but it also raises a haunting possibility. If the same code runs through everything, could someone, somewhere, have once written into it deliberately? When we look back through evolutionary history, we find evidence of something called horizontal gene transfer. It's the process by which DNA moves from one species to another without reproduction. Bacteria do it all the time. It's how they share antibiotic resistance, for example. Viruses do it too. They invade a cell, insert their genetic material, and leave behind fragments when they go. Over millions of years, those fragments can accumulate, become part of the host's genome, and even serve useful purposes. It's estimated that up to 8% of the human genome consists of viral DNA. That means a measurable portion of what makes you human was once part of something that infected your ancestors. Life, it turns out, is an editor that never stops borrowing sentences from other writers. That's what makes DNA so durable. It doesn't erase, it revises. A mutation here, an insertion there, a tiny change in the script that might make all the difference. Evolution's slow, relentless editing process has been running for billions of years. But if an intelligent civilization ever understood this mechanism before us, they wouldn't have to leave fossils. They could leave genes. A single engineered microbe capable of surviving extreme conditions could spread a message across time more effectively than any monument. Long after oceans shifted, long after ice covered the continents, that message could still be replicating itself, quietly merging with the life that followed. When we talk about the whisper in our genes, we're not just talking about DNA as a concept. We're talking about real discoveries that already blur the line between biology and archaeology. In 2010, geneticists discovered that modern humans outside of Africa carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. That might not sound like much, but it means that every person of Eurasian descent carries an ancient echo. Those sequences influence immune response, metabolism, even skin and hair traits. They're not random remnants. They're functional. They affect how your body works today. The past is literally running in your bloodstream. Later, scientists found another layer, a second, previously unknown species called the Denisovans, identified not from fossils but from a sliver of DNA extracted from a finger bone in a Siberian cave. Their genetic traces appear mostly in populations from Southeast Asia and Oceania. Again, not dead information but active, useful code. What's remarkable is that these discoveries didn't come from archaeology in the traditional sense. They came from molecular archaeology, the reading of the biological record instead of the geological one. In other words, the dirt isn't the only place history hides. Sometimes it hides inside us. Every time we sequence a new genome, human, animal or microbial, we find surprises. Genes that shouldn't be there. Sequences that look borrowed. Some appear to have jumped across species boundaries long ago. Others are so ancient that their origins are impossible to trace. If life evolved on Earth multiple times, or if it was influenced by something external, those traces might not look like alien code. They'd look like subtle, inexplicable patterns within our own DNA. Patterns we've already found but don't yet understand. There's a term geneticists use for much of our genome, non-coding DNA. For decades it was considered useless, a biological leftover, the static between stations on the radio of evolution. But research over the last 2 decades has changed that view dramatically. Those regions play roles in regulation, structure, and timing. They tell genes when to turn on or off. They help organise the 3-dimensional folding of DNA inside the nucleus. They're the quiet conductors of the symphony that keeps you alive. If someone wanted to embed information within life itself, something that could last for millions of years, those silent regions would be the safest place to do it. Protected, copied faithfully, passed along generation after generation. Of course, mainstream biology doesn't entertain ideas of messages or hidden authors. Science relies on evidence, and so far nothing has definitively pointed to deliberate design. But what's fascinating is that the more we learn about DNA, the more it looks like a storage medium capable of things we're only beginning to imagine. In 2012, researchers encoded a book, several images, and an audio file into strands of synthetic DNA. The data density was staggering, millions of times greater than any digital storage method we've created. The experiment proved something profound. DNA isn't just life's instruction manual, it's a universal information system, which means that if any intelligent species wanted to preserve knowledge across unimaginable spans of time, DNA would be the most logical choice. It self-replicates, self-repairs, and can survive frozen, dried, or even embedded in rock. Now imagine this. Long before us, perhaps millions of years before Homo sapiens evolved, another species reached that understanding. They knew their civilization couldn't last forever. They had learned that time erases everything. Metal corrodes, stone crumbles, even memory fades. So they turned to the one material that endures. They wrote themselves into life, not as myths or as gods, but as code. They altered the biology of simple organisms, embedding their knowledge in repeating sequences. Then they let evolution carry it forward. Over eons, their words were copied, mutated, blended, until all that remained were faint structures, hints that something once deliberate had passed this way. It sounds speculative, and it is. But even within accepted science, there are mysteries that feel close to this idea. Take endogenous retroviruses, viral sequences integrated into our DNA long ago. Some of them are millions of years old. A few have even been repurposed by evolution to serve useful functions, like forming the placenta in mammals. Without ancient viral DNA, mammals, and by extension humans, might not even exist. In a sense, those viruses became part of us. They left their genetic fingerprints on our development, our reproduction, our identity. That's not metaphor, it's molecular fact. So when we wonder whether something older, more complex, or perhaps more intelligent could have done something similar, the precedent already exists. Nature does it constantly. Evolution is the original bioengineer. All that changes in this scenario is the possibility of intent, the idea that someone at some point used the same processes deliberately. And if they did, we might never know it unless we learn to recognize the signature. In recent years, computational biologists have started using linguistic models, the same algorithms that analyze human language, to study DNA. They look for syntax, repetition, structure, and sometimes they find it. DNA, like language, follows patterns that convey information efficiently. Certain sequences appear more often than chance would predict. Some researchers call them genetic motifs, others information structures. To most scientists, these patterns are the result of evolutionary optimization, but viewed from another angle, they could also resemble compression algorithms, the way we store data efficiently in computers. Whether that's coincidence or something deeper remains unknown. Our genome isn't static. It's dynamic, restless. It remembers every adaptation, every catastrophe, every migration our ancestors endured. Within those sequences are records of droughts, famines, plagues, and population bottlenecks. Geneticists can see where humanity nearly vanished and where it expanded. Those records go back tens of thousands of years. But beyond that, the trail goes cold. DNA degrades over time, and after about 1 million years, it's almost impossible to recover directly from fossils, which means that if anything older ever lived and tinkered with life, its physical traces would be gone. Only the molecular echoes might remain. That's what makes this question so haunting. DNA is the one medium that could carry a legacy invisible to archaeology. If an ancient civilization wanted to leave behind evidence that couldn't be destroyed by wind, fire, or time, this would be the way. Not in artifacts, but in anatomy. The blueprint of life as their message in a bottle. When you look at it this way, the concept of inheritance becomes almost philosophical. We inherit not just traits, but possibilities. Some genes lie dormant for generations before waking up under the right conditions. Others mutate and find new purposes. Evolution doesn't waste information, it repurposes it. So perhaps we too are repurposing. The latest version of a design that's been running for longer than we can comprehend. The whisper in our genes isn't always clear. It doesn't speak in sentences or symbols. It speaks in tendencies, in instincts, in the way we reach for light, for connection, for understanding. Those drives might not just be products of environment. They could be inherited behaviours, refined and re-emphasised across countless generations. When you feel curiosity, the need to ask questions about the universe, it might be that your DNA is simply doing what it's always done, seeking survival through awareness, learning as a way to persist. That impulse might not belong to you alone. It might be the echo of an older intelligence still running in the background. If that sounds strange, remember that every species on Earth shares ancestry. We're all part of the same story. If an ancient civilization wanted to influence the future, the surest way would be to weave their legacy into the tree of life itself, not to dominate it, but to guide it gently, to ensure that intelligence would re-emerge, even after their own extinction. In that sense, we wouldn't be their descendants or their creations exactly. We'd be their continuation, the next iteration in a sequence they began. Even now, scientists are learning how to manipulate DNA in ways that seem almost magical. CRISPR technology allows us to edit genes with precision, inserting or deleting sequences at will. What we call genetic engineering might someday be viewed as the same kind of work that another species once did long ago. If we survive long enough to seed life on other worlds, we'll probably use biology as our medium too. We'll send microbes engineered to adapt, to grow, to transform barren landscapes. If those microbes endure for millions of years and eventually evolve intelligent descendants, those beings might someday look at their own DNA and ask the same question we're asking tonight. What if the first civilization left their DNA in us? That's the recursive beauty of this idea. It's not just about the past, it's about the pattern repeating. Life learns, builds, reaches awareness, and then begins to write. Each time it leaves a trace for the next. The whisper in our genes might not be a single message from one ancient people. It might be the ongoing conversation of life itself, each generation adding a word, a note, a correction, passing it along into the future. When you think of it that way, it changes what ancestry means. We often draw family trees that stop at recorded names, but the real tree goes back to the first cells, and perhaps even further. It doesn't stop with us either. It keeps growing, branching into futures we'll never see. And every leaf, every creature, every thought that will ever exist is part of that same sequence. If you could listen to your DNA, if you could somehow hear it the way we hear music, it wouldn't sound like silence. It would sound like countless voices layered over time, some clear, some faint, all contributing to the same ongoing composition. That's the whisper in our genes, the chorus of everything that ever lived, still singing quietly through us. And so, as we keep exploring this question, we start to realize that the past isn't gone, it's internal. The first civilization, if it ever existed, may not be buried in rock or lost under oceans. It may be encoded in the smallest parts of what we are, waiting for us to notice, waiting for us to understand that memory doesn't always need words or monuments. Sometimes it just needs a molecule that knows how to remember. Now that we've followed that thread through the code of life, we can start tracing it outward, toward the landscapes, the myths, and the faint archaeological hints that suggest something older might have walked this world before us. Because while DNA holds whispers, the Earth itself holds echoes, and those echoes might help us see what our genes have been trying to tell us all along. If we want to understand whether the first civilization left its traces inside us, we have to look at what might have come before what we call history. Because what we know as history is recent, shockingly so, when measured against the age of the Earth. All of recorded human civilization, from the first tablets to modern technology, fits into a sliver of time, around 6,000 years. That's less than a blink when compared to the hundreds of thousands of years that anatomically modern humans have existed, or the millions of years life had already been evolving toward us. It's like walking into a vast library, opening the final page, and realizing everything before it has been torn out. The story didn't begin with us. We simply arrived late enough to mistake the ending for the beginning. When people think about ancient civilizations, the names that surface are familiar. Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, the Maya. Each of these left monuments, writing, and evidence of social structure. But if we step back and ask when humans first could have built civilizations, when the Earth's climate, geography, and biology first allowed it, the answer stretches far beyond that small window of recorded time. For hundreds of thousands of years before the first city rose, humans and their relatives lived, travelled, and thought. They spoke in languages we'll never know, and they likely built things that left no mark. The Earth is not a kind archivist. It recycles itself constantly. Mountains rise and erode. Forests turn to dust. Oceans claim what they please. If there were civilizations before the ones we know, nature may have swept away their signatures long ago. Archaeologists sometimes speak of deep time, the vast expanse that begins where written records end. In that space, facts become rare, and imagination has to stretch between them. We find stone tools dating back more than 3 million years, shaped by hands that were not ours but still deliberate, still purposeful. We find cave paintings in Indonesia that are older than Europe's famous ones, proof that creative minds were active long before what textbooks once called the dawn of civilization. And then there are the anomalies, the scattered discoveries that don't fit neatly into our timeline. Pieces of craftsmanship found in layers of sediment that seem too old, objects whose complexity raises more questions than answers. They may have explanations grounded in geology or erosion, but together they form a quiet pattern of discomfort. They remind us that the record we trust is built on fragments. To understand what might be lost, imagine the passage of even 100,000 years. A city made of metal and glass would vanish under that span. Steel rusts to dust. Concrete crumbles. Plastics break down. After a few million years, the entire surface of the planet has reshaped itself through plate tectonics and erosion. The continents drift. The oceans carve new coastlines. Volcanoes layer the world in fresh stone. The geological record keeps almost nothing. Even bones dissolve, leaving only impressions in rare cases. So if an advanced civilization had existed 10 million years ago, there might be almost no visible trace of it now. The only durable evidence could be chemical, traces in sediments, isotopic signatures, or alterations to the DNA of species that survived them. This idea doesn't belong to science fiction. It's a real question discussed occasionally in scientific circles under what's called the Silurian hypothesis, named with tongue-in-cheek humour after a reptilian species from old television fiction. It asks simply, if an industrial civilization had risen on Earth long before humans, would we be able to detect it now? The conclusion, surprisingly, is maybe not. Given enough time, almost all direct evidence would vanish. Only subtle chemical imprints might remain, perhaps in the form of unusual concentrations of metals, fossil fuels, or synthetic compounds embedded in ancient rock. Even then, distinguishing those from natural processes would be difficult. The deeper we go into time, the blurrier it becomes. When you start to think in these scales, it becomes obvious that we could easily be missing entire chapters of our planet's story. We assume civilization is rare, a recent and fragile phenomenon, but the conditions that make civilization possible, stability, liquid water, moderate temperatures, rich ecosystems, have existed many times before. There have been warm periods and ice ages, rises and falls of sea levels that would have wiped out any coastal settlements. The surface of the Earth we walk on today is temporary. If another intelligent species rose long ago, it might have lived and died entirely before our continents even took their current shapes. And if it understood biology well enough, it might have found a way to persist through us. Humanity, as we define it, occupies a narrow branch of the evolutionary tree, but intelligence itself may not be unique. Crows solve puzzles, dolphins communicate in structured ways, octopuses use tools and seem to possess awareness. None of these species build skyscrapers or write poetry, but they show that consciousness, or at least complex cognition, isn't limited to one form of life. Given time, any of them might have gone further, and that's just among modern animals. Go back tens of millions of years, and the possibilities widen. Intelligent life doesn't always mean familiar life. If we found evidence of an ancient civilization in the fossil record, it might not look human at all. It might not even have bones. The fossil record gives us a few windows into deep prehistory, but those windows are narrow and distorted. Fossils form only under rare conditions, when organisms are buried quickly, in the right type of sediment, without oxygen or scavengers. The vast majority of life leaves no fossil record at all. The Earth's deep oceans, which cover most of the planet, are even less preserved. The ocean floor constantly renews itself, erasing whatever lies there every few 100 million years. That means any coastal or seafaring civilization from deep time, which is exactly where we would expect advanced life to flourish, would vanish almost completely. So the absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence. It may just be geology doing what it does best, cleaning the slate. Still, hints remain, not necessarily proof of lost civilizations, but reminders of how little we truly know about the distant past. In Africa, stone tools made by early humans have been found that date back millions of years, their makers long gone. Some show patterns of craftsmanship beyond what we expect from their time. In Siberia and the Arctic, buried under ice, there are unexplored layers of soil that could hold clues from climates and ecosystems long forgotten. The deeper we dig, the more surprises we find. Each one suggests that the story of intelligence on Earth may be older and more complex than we imagine. But beyond physical artifacts, there are stories. Nearly every ancient culture on record speaks of an earlier age, a golden era, a lost world, a time when knowledge greater than theirs existed and then vanished. The details vary, but the themes recur. Floods that erased the world, fire from the sky, beings of immense understanding who disappeared or retreated. It's tempting to dismiss these as myths, products of imagination or metaphor. Yet across continents that never met, separated by oceans and time, the same motifs appear. That's not proof of a lost civilization, but it is evidence of shared memory, or perhaps of shared inheritance. Maybe what all those stories preserve is not a literal history, but a biological echo. An instinct that something came before us, that we are not the beginning, only the continuation. There's a reason myths often sound older than they should. They grow from the same human tendency to remember patterns that benefit survival. Oral traditions can preserve surprising amounts of information. In Australia, for example, Aboriginal stories describe coastlines and landmarks that were altered by rising seas thousands of years ago. Geological studies have confirmed those changes. That means human memory, when passed carefully through generations, can reach back into times we once thought unimaginable. If cultural memory can stretch that far, genetic memory might stretch even farther. And that's where our two lines of inquiry meet. The Earth's forgotten civilizations and the whisper in our genes. If humanity arose from older, simpler ancestors, and if those ancestors were shaped, even slightly, by something or someone before them, we might find the traces not in ruins, but in recurring tendencies. The urge to build, to organize, to mark the passage of time, to look upward and wonder. These are the hallmarks of civilization, but they also feel instinctive, almost inherited. When the first humans carved patterns into bone or painted symbols on cave walls, they weren't just expressing themselves. They were reenacting behaviours written somewhere deep in their biology. The compulsion to create order out of chaos might not be cultural alone. It might be genetic, a coded reflex passed down from those who first mastered it. Geologists sometimes say that Earth has had many versions of itself. Whole ecosystems have come and gone. Continents have collided and drifted apart. During each stable period, life flourished and reached complexity. It's conceivable that one of those epochs, perhaps tens of millions of years before us, produced a form of intelligence that didn't leave fossils we'd recognise. Not necessarily humanoid, not even mammalian. It could have been reptilian, aquatic, or something entirely different. If it reached technological sophistication, even briefly, and understood biology, it might have left its mark in ways we can't yet detect. Evolution doesn't reset to zero after extinction. It builds on what remains, and what remains most reliably is DNA. If that civilization existed, it might have faced the same questions we face now. How to survive inevitable planetary changes, how to preserve knowledge beyond catastrophe. Perhaps they looked at their world, at the cycles of ice and fire, and realised that the only way to truly endure was to merge with the mechanisms of life itself. They might have learned how to alter genomes, how to seed life forms that could carry fragments of their identity forward. If they succeeded, we might never know them by name. We'd simply inherit their instructions, feeling their curiosity as our own. The geological record does show moments of sudden, mysterious change, extinction events followed by bursts of new life, as if something reset and then restarted with fresh designs. Most are explained by natural causes, meteor impacts, volcanic activity, shifts in climate. But it's hard not to wonder about the pattern. Each time life rebounds faster, more diverse, more complex. It's as if the process itself learns. Maybe that's just how evolution works. Feedback and refinement over eons. Or maybe the system carries within it a mechanism for recovery, something designed to ensure that intelligence reappears no matter how many times it's erased. The truth is that we stand on the surface of a world that's rewritten itself countless times. Civilizations, whether natural or constructed, vanish into the sediment. The Earth gives no preference to memory, yet somehow knowledge persists. We, as a species, appear precisely when the planet becomes most hospitable again, as if emerging on cue. Our arrival might be coincidence, or it might be the latest phase of an ancient rhythm. Either way, it feels like the Earth remembers what it once was, and we are part of that recollection. Science, for all its caution, is beginning to explore the boundaries of prehistory more boldly. New dating methods push back the age of human artifacts by tens of thousands of years. Genetic studies reveal migrations and interbreeding events we never suspected. Each discovery extends the timeline, blurring the neat edges of what we thought we knew. The more we learn, the less it seems like civilization began suddenly. It looks more like a long, slow awakening, one that might have happened before and could happen again. If there were earlier civilizations, their influence might not be technological in the way we think. It could be biological, psychological, even linguistic. The structures of our minds, how we form patterns, how we perceive order, how we seek meaning, might themselves be inherited systems, optimized over countless iterations of thinking species. When you experience awe or the desire to understand your origins, it might be that you're continuing a chain of cognition much older than humanity. Perhaps that's why these questions resonate so deeply. We feel them because they're part of us. The silence of deep time can feel unsettling, but it's also full of potential. It reminds us that knowledge doesn't always survive in obvious forms. Sometimes it survives in behaviour, in instinct, in chemistry. The Earth itself is a memory device. It cycles recording information through layers of rock and ice. Our species may just be one of its ways of remembering itself, the latest attempt by life to observe and interpret its own history. If the first civilization ever existed, it might have been the moment when life first became aware of itself, when it first learned to look backward and wonder where it came from. That awareness, once awakened, may never have gone extinct. It could simply have changed form until it reappeared in us. And so, as we sift through fossils and study genes, we're not just searching for others, we're searching for the continuity between them and us. The continuity that runs deeper than tools, deeper than art, deeper even than thought. The continuity that might connect every intelligent being that's ever lived on this planet through the same enduring thread. The need to leave something of themselves behind. We do it through writing, through data, through children. They might have done it through DNA. The past, the true past, is hidden beneath miles of sediment and billions of years of change. But that doesn't mean it's gone. It's still shaping what we are, guiding how we think, influencing what we strive for. If we listen carefully enough, we might find that we are already hearing it, in the patterns of our biology, in the repetition of our myths, in the relentless pull to rediscover what we've lost. And as that thought settles in, the story begins to turn inward again. Because the next step isn't to dig deeper into the ground, but to look at the stories that survived, the ancient myths and recurring symbols that might hold the faint reflection of those who came before us. Those stories are like fossils of the mind, and they may be the closest we'll ever come to meeting the first civilization face to face. When evidence is scarce, stories become our fossils. They are the things that survive when everything else has turned to dust. Long before people wrote, they remembered, and what they remembered eventually became myth. Across continents and ages, those myths carried fragments of the world as it once was. To most, they sound like imagination, tales meant to explain what couldn't yet be explained. But when you start listening closely, when you compare them not as separate legends but as echoes of the same voice, a pattern emerges. A strange repetition of themes that seems too consistent to be coincidence. Nearly every culture speaks of a time before the present order, an earlier age, often brighter, wiser, more complete. Then something happens, a flood, a fire, a fall from the sky, and that age ends. Civilization restarts from the fragments that remain. It's a story told in different words by Sumerians, Egyptians, Greeks, Hindus, and the first peoples of the Americas. In Australia, the Dreamtime tales describe ancestral beings who shaped the world, taught early humans, and then disappeared into the land itself. In the Andes, the legend of Viracocha tells of a godlike figure who came before the Incas, teaching agriculture and knowledge before walking westward across the ocean. In West Africa, the Dogon speak of beings who came from the stars, bringing knowledge of the cosmos far beyond what their technology could have shown them. At first glance, it's tempting to group these as products of imagination. After all, humans everywhere look for origin stories. We want to know where we came from, so we invent explanations that make emotional sense. But some of these tales contain details that don't fit easy dismissal. Descriptions of astronomical cycles known only to modern science, references to floods that align with real geological events, warnings of celestial impacts that correspond to craters later discovered. Whether those details are coincidences or evidence of long-term memory is still debated, but the possibility that stories can preserve facts for thousands of years is no longer controversial. The myth of a great flood, for instance, appears on every inhabited continent. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes one in Mesopotamia long before the story of Noah appeared in Hebrew tradition. In India, the ancient text of the Satapatha Brahmana tells of a man saved from a world-engulfing deluge by a giant fish. In the Americas, the Hopi, the Maya, and the Inca each tell of waters that rose to erase a corrupt or disobedient world. Indigenous groups in Australia and the Pacific have oral histories describing coastlines that no longer exist, drowned when sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. Geological evidence confirms that between about 12 and 8,000 years ago, the oceans did rise hundreds of feet, swallowing vast areas of coastal plain. It's easy to see how memories of those floods could become myth, but what's harder to explain is how similar those memories are between people who had no contact for tens of thousands of years. The shared shape of those stories suggests something older at work, something passed down long before modern humans spread across the globe. One explanation is cultural convergence, that people across the world experience similar natural events and develop similar narratives to make sense of them. Another possibility, though, is that these are not separate inventions at all, but fragments of one shared memory. A memory that predates our known cultures, carried forward through speech, through ritual, and maybe, in ways we can't yet measure, through our biology. Myths, after all, behave like genes. They mutate slightly as they pass from one generation to the next, adapting to new environments while keeping a recognizable structure. The same way a gene might code for the instinct to seek light or water, a story might encode the instinct to remember a great event. Both are forms of survival, one biological, one cultural, but deeply intertwined. Consider how quickly oral tradition can become instinctive. When a community tells the same story for thousands of years, the details start to sink below conscious memory. The narrative becomes part of identity, shaping behaviour even when the original meaning is forgotten. A story about the sea swallowing the land might evolve into a taboo against building too close to the shore. A myth about a fallen star could preserve the memory of an ancient impact event. We see hints of this all over the world. In the Aboriginal stories of northern Australia, there are precise descriptions of islands that were once part of the mainland, details that align with modern bathymetric maps of the ocean floor. The people who told those stories had no instruments, no charts, and yet their memory preserved geological facts across 7,000 years. That's far beyond what written history usually survives. If such endurance is possible for human memory, what about biological memory? Could the instinctive sense of loss, of looking backward towards something greater, be a residue of genetic memory? The whisper in our genes may not speak in words, but perhaps it influences the stories we create, nudging them towards certain recurring themes: beginnings, falls, rebirths, and hidden knowledge. These themes aren't just literary devices, they're biological archetypes, reflections of how life itself behaves. Everything that lives emerges, grows, decays, and begins again. Civilizations do the same. Maybe the stories that feel most profound to us are the ones that mirror our own evolutionary cycles. In ancient Mesopotamia, the oldest records we have describe not the beginning of civilization but the end of a previous one. The Sumerian king list begins with rulers who reigned for impossibly long periods, thousands of years each, before a great flood swept over the land. After the flood, kingship was lowered from heaven again, and ordinary lifespans returned. Scholars interpret those long ages as symbolic or mythic exaggeration, but they also sound like distorted echoes, memories stretched by generations of retelling. If there truly was a civilization before recorded history, and if its memory survived through oral tradition, this is exactly the shape it might take. Fragments wrapped in reverence, half remembered as divine or legendary. Even in cultures separated by oceans, we see similar frameworks. Civilizations descending from the sky, gods teaching agriculture. knowledge passed from a vanished race to a new one. In the Popol Vuh of the Maya, the creators attempt to make humans several times, using mud, then wood, before finally shaping them from maize. Each attempt fails until the final version can speak and remember. In that story, you can hear a faint reflection of evolution itself, repeated experiments until awareness emerges. The same logic appears in the Greek tale of Prometheus, who shapes humans from clay and gives them fire, symbolizing knowledge stolen from the gods. Across Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, cultures tell of beings who arrived from the stars or descended to Earth, taught wisdom, then departed, promising to return. Whether these were symbolic explanations for cultural contact or distant memories of something older, they reveal how deeply humanity feels the presence of a lost teacher. Some of the oldest myths are not about creation at all, but about transformation. The idea that the world we know was built upon the ruins of something older. The Aztecs believed we live in the fifth age of the sun, with 4 previous worlds destroyed by cataclysm. Hindu cosmology describes endless cycles of creation and destruction, with each world age lasting millions of years. To modern ears that sounds purely mythological, but the timescales are startlingly close to those of geological epochs. It's as though early humans sensed, through some means we no longer understand, that Earth renews itself repeatedly, and that we live atop layers of forgotten worlds. If the first civilization truly existed, its disappearance might have been the event at the root of all these stories. The flood could have been a global disaster that ended them. The gods who departed might have been their descendants or survivors trying to preserve fragments of what they knew. The confusion between divine and mortal could be the natural result of encountering a species so advanced that it appeared godlike. To a culture rebuilding from ruin, technology would seem like magic, and knowledge like power from beyond. Over generations, those impressions would soften into myth. The details would blur, but the emotional weight would remain. The sense that something magnificent once existed and was lost. But myths don't just describe the past, they shape the future. When a civilization rebuilds after catastrophe, it does so in the image of its stories. The structures, rituals, and hierarchies that follow are echoes of the remembered world. In that way, even if the first civilization vanished physically, it might have guided everyone that came after through the blueprint of its myths. The repetition of sacred mountains, cosmic floods, and returning gods might not be coincidence. They might be inherited designs, the cultural version of a genetic code. The repetition goes deeper than imagery. Many myths carry moral or structural patterns that mirror biological cycles. The fall of knowledge followed by renewal mirrors the way ecosystems recover after extinction events. The creation of humans from the remnants of previous worlds parallels how evolution reuses old genetic material to build new forms. It's almost as if the stories are expressions of the same underlying process, translated from the biological to the cultural. The first civilization, if it existed, may have written its legacy twice, once in DNA and once in story, each mirroring the other so that one could survive if the other was lost. That may sound abstract, but there are measurable examples of story influence in biology. The way cultures treat reproduction, health, and environment affects which genes thrive. Beliefs shape behavior, behavior shapes selection, and over generations, selection shapes genes. In that sense, myth and DNA are partners in evolution. Each guides the other subtly over long spans of time. When you see similar stories arising independently across the world, they may not be coincidences at all, but reflections of shared biology, of minds tuned by the same ancestral experiences remembering in parallel. It's also possible that our need to tell stories itself was an evolutionary gift, a way to preserve vital information long before writing existed. A tribe that remembered a story about poisonous plants or dangerous floods would survive better than one that forgot. Over time, natural selection would favour minds that encoded memory in narrative form. That impulse to frame reality as story could be one of the oldest traits we carry, one inherited not from any single culture, but from the first civilization that learned how to preserve knowledge through metaphor. What's striking is how much these myths still move us, even when we no longer believe them literally. They awaken something ancient in us, the feeling of being part of a larger cycle, of belonging to a history that stretches beyond the reach of record. That emotional resonance might be the whisper of recognition. When you hear about a flood, a fall, or a return, it feels familiar because it reflects something written deep within our nature. Maybe the reason these stories endure is because they're not just tales of the past. They're reminders of what we are. Beings that remember even when we forget. Carriers of ancient patterns, drawn to rediscover them again and again. Modern researchers studying mythology use a method similar to genetics. They compare myths the way biologists compare DNA sequences, tracing similarities and differences to find common ancestors. This approach, sometimes called phylogenetic mythology, reveals that many of the world's stories can indeed be traced back to older, shared prototypes. The tale of a hero who faces trials, descends into darkness, and returns transformed appears in every culture and seems to trace back tens of thousands of years. It's the narrative version of a gene conserved across species. That consistency suggests that storytelling didn't arise randomly. It was inherited, selected for, and transmitted with remarkable fidelity. It may even have begun before humans themselves were fully modern, a product of minds evolving the capacity to simulate, to imagine, to anticipate. So when we talk about the shadows in our stories, we're not talking about fantasy. We're talking about memory, the kind that doesn't live in any one person, but in the collective pattern of how humanity thinks. Those shadows might be all that remain of an earlier intelligence that taught us the habit of remembering through story. Every time we retell a myth of loss or rebirth, we're performing the same act they once did. We're keeping the memory alive, and that memory, faint as it is, continues to guide us. It shapes our art, our science, our sense of destiny. It pushes us to search for origins even when the evidence is gone, because something inside us seems to know that we came from somewhere older than our history books admit. The stories don't give us proof, but they give us direction. They point backward toward the darkness before history and whisper that we are not the first to wonder. As we follow that whisper, it becomes clear that the next step in understanding isn't about myths alone, but about the language written into the code of life itself. The myths tell us what might have been. The genes tell us what is. Together they might form the bridge between imagination and biology, between the stories we tell and the code that made us able to tell them. And that bridge leads us deeper still, into the question of how life itself came to carry knowledge, not just of survival, but of memory. Because within that code lies a kind of language, one that may hold the oldest story of all. Life speaks in a language older than words. Long before humans learned to name things, long before sound carried meaning, the cells of the world were already communicating. They spoke through molecules, through chemical signals that told them when to divide, when to rest, when to change. That silent conversation has never stopped. It still happens inside you right now, in every living thing that exists. It is the oldest and most universal dialogue known to the planet. The more closely you listen to it, the more it begins to resemble a code, a message carried across billions of years, written in the same script everywhere on Earth. That script is DNA, 4 letters, endlessly rearranged, spelling out everything that life can be. A, T, C, and G. Adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. Each one connects with its partner in predictable pairs, creating a chain that copies itself with astonishing precision. That pairing, that repetition, is the reason life can remember. When a cell divides, it doesn't simply replicate its structure. It replicates its memory. It passes down instructions written in a molecular alphabet that's been consistent since the dawn of life. Every creature that ever lived speaks this same language. The tree outside your window, the bacteria in the soil, the cells in your skin. They're all fluent in the same syntax. We tend to think of DNA as something purely biological, but it's also linguistic in its structure. Each gene is a phrase, a unit of meaning. Groups of genes form paragraphs, pathways, entire chapters of instruction. They interact the way sentences do, modifying and regulating each other. Some are expressed loudly, others quietly, and together they compose the narrative that becomes a living being. What makes this language remarkable isn't just its efficiency, but its endurance. It doesn't fade or crumble like spoken words. It's stable across generations, copied billions of times, corrected by molecular editors that ensure the message continues. It's a communication system built to survive deep time. For most of our species' history, this language was invisible. We lived surrounded by it, shaped by it, yet had no idea it existed. Only in the 20th century did we begin to realize that life's diversity could be reduced to a single repeating pattern. When scientists first saw the structure of the double helix, it was like discovering the alphabet of creation. Every organism, every cell was part of the same vast text. That realization changed everything. But it also raised a question that still lingers in the quiet corners of science. Who wrote it first? The usual answer is simple: no one did. DNA evolved naturally from simpler molecules that learned to copy themselves. Through endless cycles of trial and error, chemistry became biology. Yet even that description feels like an echo of language. Molecules learned, systems remembered, information transmitted. We can't describe life without the vocabulary of communication, because communication is what life is. Every process within you is a conversation between molecules, between the present and the past. That's what makes the idea of the first civilization's DNA so haunting. If life itself is a message, could someone have added a footnote? Could an earlier intelligence have inserted a phrase, a sentence, a pattern into that ancient language, not to change life completely, but to leave behind a mark, a sign that they were here? Theoretically, it's possible. Modern scientists have already done it. In laboratories, researchers have encoded entire texts, digital files, even short films into synthetic DNA. They've demonstrated that the molecule can store enormous amounts of data, millions of times more per gram than any hard drive. And unlike human technology, DNA can last for thousands, even millions of years if preserved properly. It's self-replicating, self-repairing, and compatible with every organism on the planet. As a storage medium, it's perfect. If you wanted to send a message to the distant future, DNA would be your best option. The challenge is that life keeps editing itself. Mutations, recombinations, and environmental pressures constantly rewrite the text. Over deep time, any deliberate message would become buried under layers of evolutionary noise. But what if it wasn't meant to be read directly? What if it was meant to influence, not instruct? Instead of words, the message could be tendencies. The drive toward intelligence, cooperation, curiosity. Traits that would ensure that sooner or later the recipients would rediscover the message themselves. That would be the most elegant form of communication imaginable. One that doesn't need to be understood to work. Scientists studying the origins of life sometimes describe DNA as information organized by survival. Every successful gene is one that produced continuity. Every sequence that failed disappeared. Over time, that natural selection carved meaning out of randomness. But if life was seeded or influenced intentionally, that same process could act as the perfect encryption method. The message would survive only if it helped life survive. It would hide within function, indistinguishable from the natural code around it. Only by studying vast numbers of genomes, comparing their structures, might we begin to detect patterns that seem too deliberate, too consistent to be explained by chance. Some researchers have already noticed peculiar regularities in the genetic code. For instance, the way codons, the three-letter groups that represent amino acids, are arranged seems unusually efficient, minimizing the risk of errors during replication. It's so mathematically optimized that computer scientists have compared it to engineered systems. To most biologists, this efficiency is a product of natural selection, but to a few, it hints at something more, that the genetic code might not just be the result of evolution, but the product of intelligent design from deep time. Not design in the religious sense, but in the technical one, the careful tuning of a system to ensure durability and adaptability. If that were true, then the authors may not have created life, but rather optimized it, refined its grammar so it could continue indefinitely. Think about how human language evolves. It begins with chaos, noises and gestures, and over time it becomes structured. Grammar emerges, patterns repeat and meaning stabilizes. Eventually it becomes capable of poetry, philosophy, science. DNA follows a similar path. Random replication gives way to order, and order becomes capable of innovation. Whether that process happened by pure chance or with a nudge from an older intelligence, the result is the same, a language capable of learning. Inside your body, that language never stops speaking. Every second, billions of instructions are read, copied and executed. Enzymes act as translators, reading the script and building proteins. Those proteins in turn fold into shapes that perform specific tasks, opening channels, repairing damage, transmitting signals. It's an intricate conversation, and it's happening in perfect silence. You are in essence the product of an unbroken stream of communication stretching back to the first cell that ever lived. That cell may have been the first word in a sentence still being written. When you think about it that way, the boundary between biology and language begins to blur. Both are systems for storing and transmitting information. Both evolve. Both require redundancy to survive errors. And both carry meaning only when interpreted by something that can understand them. Without a reader, DNA is just a string of molecules. Without a mind, words are just ink on paper. The act of reading, whether genetic or linguistics, brings the code to life. That's why some scientists say that consciousness itself might be the ultimate expression of biology's language, the moment the message became aware of itself. If a civilization existed before us, and if it understood this connection, its greatest achievement might not have been technology or architecture, but the mastery of information as life. They might have realized that biology is the most stable medium in the universe, capable of surviving planetary changes, even extinction events. To ensure their survival, they wouldn't need to escape their world. They'd only need to embed themselves into the self-replicating systems already here. Once seeded, those systems would spread, adapt, and eventually evolve intelligence again. We would then be their continuation, their story retold through new voices. In that sense, the language of life isn't just metaphor, it's literal. DNA doesn't just describe life, it is life. It's both the message and the messenger, both the author and the script. When you look at it through that lens, evolution becomes less a process of random change and more a kind of communication, a long, slow conversation between generations. Each mutation, each adaptation, is like a new word added to the story. The structure of life itself suggests that meaning is intrinsic to existence. The more we study genetics, the clearer this becomes. The genome isn't a simple list of instructions, it's an interconnected web. One gene can affect dozens of traits, and one trait can be influenced by hundreds of genes. The relationships form a network of feedback loops that resemble the structure of a language far more than a mechanical blueprint. It's full of context, nuance, and ambiguity, just like speech. The same sequence can have different meanings depending on where and when it's read. That adaptability is what allows life to evolve, to change without losing its core identity. It's the molecular equivalent of culture, passed down and reinterpreted endlessly. There's also a kind of grammar to it. The genetic code follows rules, but it also allows for exceptions. There are stop signals and start signals, punctuation marks that divide one instruction from another. When errors occur, repair enzymes act like editors, correcting mistakes. Sometimes they let small changes through, introducing new possibilities. The biological version of improvisation. It's this balance between order and variation that makes life creative. Too much structure, and nothing new emerges. Too little, and the system collapses. Life seems to operate at the edge of that balance, maintaining meaning while allowing exploration. If that's not language, it's something close enough to deserve the name. Imagine if, deep within this language, there was a trace of someone else's writing, a structure that doesn't quite fit, a phrase repeated across species for no clear reason. We've already found sequences that fit that description, though they're usually dismissed as evolutionary accidents. But what if some of them aren't? What if those recurring motifs, sequences that appear again and again with no known function, are remnants of a message we can no longer read? Over billions of years, syntax becomes accent, accent becomes rhythm, rhythm becomes instinct. The original meaning might be gone, but the pattern persists. We live according to it without knowing it's there. In recent years, a few scientists and philosophers have suggested that the universe itself may be information-based, that matter and energy are just expressions of data. If that's true, then life isn't an anomaly. It's a natural consequence of information trying to organise itself. DNA, in that view, is not a product of chance, but an inevitable structure. A way for the universe to store and process information efficiently. And if intelligence arises within that system, it might eventually learn to use the same language deliberately, creating a feedback loop across time. Each intelligent species becomes a translator, learning to read and write in the same universal code. If that's the case, then the first civilization didn't just leave its DNA in us, it left us the language of life itself. Every breath you take, every heartbeat, every thought is the result of that language being read and executed flawlessly billions of times per second. The molecules inside you don't know they're ancient, but they are. They've been passed down from cell to cell since the beginning. You are, in a very real sense, an unbroken chain of memory stretching back to the origin of life. The atoms that make you were formed in stars, but the pattern that arranges them was formed in something even older. The first living system that learned to copy itself. Whether that system was a natural accident or a deliberate act, it's the same one that speaks inside you now. The closer we look at the code, the more we realise how little we understand about its full structure. There are layers within layers, feedback loops that defy simple mapping. It's possible that the information we see, the part that builds proteins and maintains cells, is only a surface layer, like the visible text of a document hiding metadata beneath. If so, there could be entire dimensions of information encoded in DNA that we haven't yet learned to read. We might be walking around with libraries of ancient data inside us, invisible because we don't yet know the language fully. Maybe as technology improves, we'll find those hidden levels, structures that look less like biology and more like design. Maybe we'll learn that evolution was guided not by chance, but by a self-sustaining system meant to ensure that intelligence would keep reappearing until it could recognize its own origins. Maybe we already are that recognition, and every new discovery we make about genetics is simply us learning to read a message that was written for us billions of years ago. And as that realization slowly takes shape, it begins to blur the distinction between science and story. Because in both, we're trying to decode meaning. We're trying to listen to something older than ourselves. The myths told us what might have been. The genes show us what is. Together they form the same sentence written in two dialects. One emotional, one molecular. Both telling us that we are part of a continuity that began before history, before even memory, in the first language life ever spoke. The story doesn't end there. If life truly carries language, and that language truly carries memory, then perhaps some of those memories are still active, shaping how we behave, how we feel, how we remember. To understand that, we have to look at the traces left behind, the ghostly remnants of beings who came before us, whose DNA still speaks faintly within our own, because not all voices from the past are gone. Some of them are still whispering quietly inside every one of us. When we talk about inheritance, we often picture family traits, the shape of a face, a laugh that sounds like a parent's, a familiar gesture that echoes someone long gone. But the inheritance written in our DNA goes far deeper than what we see in the mirror. It reaches back beyond families, beyond species, into the long corridors of prehistory where the boundaries between one kind of human and another were still being drawn. Hidden within your genome are fragments of others, the remnants of beings who once walked the same earth but vanished thousands of years ago. Their genes are still here, quietly influencing how your body works, how you respond to the world, even how you dream. They are the ghost genes, the molecular shadows of ancestors you've never met. Their story began when we believed we were alone. For much of the 20th century, the picture of human evolution was simple, a line leading from primitive ancestors to us. Then, slowly, the fossils began to complicate that story. Neanderthals appeared first, intelligent and capable, but extinct. Then Denisovans, discovered not through a skeleton or a skull, but through a few fragments of bone in a Siberian cave. At first, they seemed like footnotes, evolutionary experiments that didn't survive. But when geneticists began sequencing ancient DNA, everything changed. They found that Neanderthals hadn't vanished completely. They had mingled with modern humans. Their DNA lived on, not in a few isolated people, but in almost everyone of Eurasian descent. That realization arrived like a quiet shock. It meant that the lines between species weren't as clear as we thought. Humanity wasn't a single story, but a tapestry woven from multiple threads. Each time populations met, they exchanged more than culture. They exchanged code, and that code still functions. Some Neanderthal genes help regulate our immune systems, protecting us from infections our ancestors might not have survived. Others influence how our bodies process fat, or how we respond to sunlight. A few are linked to neurological traits, affecting sleep cycles, mood, and even sensitivity to pain. It's not just ancient history, it's still working inside you, every moment of your life. The same is true of the Denisovans. Though their remains are scarce, their DNA appears across Asia and the Pacific. In Tibetans, a particular Denisovan gene helps the body use oxygen efficiently at high altitudes, a perfect adaptation for living above the clouds. That single inherited sequence shapes the physiology of millions of people today. It's a direct line from a vanished species to a heartbeat in the present. When you realize that, the phrase extinct species starts to lose its meaning. They didn't disappear completely, they integrated. Their legacy continued, not as memory, but as function. These discoveries opened a new way of seeing our species. Instead of a clean evolutionary tree, we now see a dense network. Branches that twist, merge, and reconnect. Our DNA carries evidence of those ancient meetings, the moments when different kinds of humans encountered one another, shared knowledge, and shared blood. Each fusion left a trace, a signature written into the genome. When scientists compare those signatures across modern populations, they can reconstruct migrations and encounters that happened tens of thousands of years ago. The patterns reveal a history not of isolation but of connection. We didn't evolve alone, we evolved together, borrowing and blending until the boundaries between us became meaningless. But the story goes even deeper than that, because alongside the genes we can identify, the ones we can match to Neanderthals or Denisovans, there are fragments we can't trace at all, segments of DNA that don't match any known species, not even the most ancient we've sequenced. Some researchers call them ghost lineages. They appear in the genomes of modern humans as if from nowhere, like pages torn from a book we've never read. They're evidence of encounters with beings we haven't yet found in the fossil record, perhaps other branches of humanity that vanished without leaving bones behind. In Africa, where human evolution has its deepest roots, these ghost genes are especially common. They may come from archaic humans who lived hundreds of thousands of years ago, whose existence we know only from the traces they left inside us. What's remarkable is that these genetic ghosts aren't inert. Many of them appear to be active, influencing biological functions even now. Some affect how our immune systems respond to diseases, while others are linked to brain development or metabolism. They're not errors, they're contributors. Which means the DNA of vanished species isn't just buried in us, it's alive in the way we live. When you consider that, the line between past and present becomes faint. We are quite literally carrying the living memory of lost worlds. It's easy to think of this in biological terms alone, but there's another layer to it, one that brings us back to the idea of inheritance as information. Every time two species exchange genes, they're exchanging data. They're blending their evolutionary experience into a shared code. Over millions of years, this process of merging and adaptation could accumulate not just biological advantages, but deeper structural patterns, tendencies in how life organizes itself, how it responds to change, even how it perceives its environment. If intelligence arose once, it could, in theory, leave behind these patterns in the genome, dormant until reactivated by similar conditions. Those patterns could shape not just bodies, but behaviours. They could be the echoes of cognitive architectures long gone, still resonating quietly in us. Consider how certain instincts appear universal across cultures and species. The urge to protect offspring, the fear of falling, the attraction to symmetry, the impulse to seek meaning. These aren't learned traits. They're built into the architecture of the brain. They may be the result of evolution alone, or they may be inherited frameworks of perception, passed down through genetic memory. The ghost genes, in that sense, might not just control physiology. They might influence how we think. They could be the molecular residue of ancient minds. There are moments in the fossil record when new forms of intelligence seem to appear suddenly. The emergence of symbolic art, complex tools, ritual burial, each arrives almost abruptly, as though something awakened. Some scientists attribute this to gradual cultural development that finally reached a tipping point, but it could also be the result of genetic integration. When two populations mixed, their combined DNA might have unlocked new capacities. Perhaps the genes from one group interacted with those of another to produce cognitive synergy, a blending that made new forms of thought possible. If that happened once, it might have happened many times. Intelligence could be a recurring phenomenon, not an endpoint but a rhythm. When you think about DNA as information, the ghost genes take on a different meaning. They're not just leftovers, they're archived data. Each fragment tells a story of survival, of adaptation, of innovation. The genes that persisted did so because they worked. They carried something useful, something the world still needed. In that way, the genome acts like a vast collective memory, one that doesn't distinguish between species, only between what endures and what doesn't. The past is continually edited, but never erased. Even extinction doesn't completely delete a species, it only removes the visible part. The invisible part, the code, continues to circulate through life. Sometimes the effects of these ancient inheritances are visible in unexpected ways. Geneticists studying immune responses, for example, have found that certain Neanderthal genes make modern humans more resistant to specific viruses, the same ones that likely plagued Ice Age Europe. But those same genes can also increase the risk of autoimmune disorders in modern environments. It's a trade-off written in deep time. The ghosts that once protected us now shape our vulnerabilities. We live with their legacy, for better and for worse. The same is true of our brains. Some studies suggest that certain inherited genetic variations might influence neural connectivity, affecting everything from creativity to susceptibility to depression. These are subtle effects, almost impossible to isolate fully, but their presence reminds us that our minds are mosaics of many past lives. The patterns of thought that feel most personal may have roots stretching back into forgotten epochs. The way we dream, the way we imagine, the way we search for meaning, all could be influenced by the invisible hand of the ghost genes. It's not difficult to see how this idea connects back to the possibility of a civilization older than history. If humanity carries the DNA of other species, and if some of that DNA came from sources we haven't yet identified, it's conceivable that we're also carrying the remnants of something even older, something that wasn't just another species of human, but a lineage that mastered biology itself. The genetic ghosts might be more than random inheritance. They might be the fingerprints of deliberate design, hidden within the noise of evolution. A kind of molecular watermark left by an earlier civilization to ensure their influence would continue. It wouldn't have to be an obvious message. It could be as subtle as a set of predispositions, a curiosity that drives us to explore, an empathy that binds us together, a sense of wonder that makes us reach beyond survival. Those traits, after all, are what make civilization possible. They're also what make us human. Perhaps they're not accidents. Perhaps they were encouraged, nurtured, selected long ago. In that sense, we might be the continuation of a project that began in the deep past, one designed not to preserve knowledge, but to preserve the capacity for knowledge. Every cell in your body is a time capsule. Within it are sequences that have persisted through every extinction event, every ice age, every catastrophe this planet has endured. Some of those sequences are billions of years old. Others arrived more recently, through the mingling of species. Together they form a single living archive, one that connects you to every being that ever lived. The ghost genes are the pages of that archive that we can still read, but there are more we can't. Pages written in languages we haven't yet learned to interpret, codes that might have once meant something specific but now appear random. They might be silent, but silence isn't the same as absence. It's often the space where meaning waits. When you think about the continuity of DNA, the persistence of information across unimaginable spans of time, it becomes easier to see how a civilization could survive extinction by embedding itself in biology. Fossils crumble, records fade, but genes persist. They replicate, they adapt. If the first civilization understood that, they might have chosen not to fight extinction, but to transform it into inheritance, to let their essence, their knowledge, their way of thinking, diffuse into the fabric of life itself. Over time, that legacy would fragment, mutate, and resurface in countless forms, until one day, a species capable of reflection would emerge, carrying within it the quiet echoes of those who came before. In that light, our fascination with ancestry takes on a new dimension. When people trace their genetic heritage, they're not just looking for relatives, they're listening for echoes. They're trying to locate themselves within a larger continuity. The test results tell us where we came from geographically, but not what we carry philosophically. The tendencies, the dreams, the faint memories encoded in the ghost genes, those can't be mapped, only felt. They surface as intuition, as déjà vu, as that strange sense of recognition when we encounter something new, yet familiar. Maybe that's why so many ancient myths describe humanity as a blend of heaven and earth, of divine and mortal. Maybe those stories are symbolic memories of the time when our ancestors merged with others, when different kinds of beings came together to create something new. The myths speak of gods mingling with humans, teaching them, changing them. The genome tells the same story in different terms, lineages meeting, exchanging information, creating hybrids stronger and more complex than either parent. It's the same pattern, told in two languages, one genetic, one narrative, and somewhere beneath all of it, there might be one more layer, a trace not of Neanderthals or Denisovans, but of something older still, a civilization that left no ruins, only genes. The ghost genes could be their final message, written not to be read but to be lived. Every time a child is born, every time life begins again, that message is copied, updated and continued. It's not a story we tell, it's a story we are. When you close your eyes and think about your ancestors, you probably imagine faces, people in distant times. But the truth is that your ancestors are not just human. They include every creature that contributed to the long experiment of life. The single-celled organisms, the early mammals, the beings whose names we'll never know. They all whisper in your genome. They all shaped what you are. Some of them may even have been intelligent in ways we can't imagine, leaving behind not tools or art, but patterns of thought encoded in biology. Those patterns might still guide us, steering the course of evolution toward awareness, again and again. If that's true, then we're not the end of a story. We're the continuation of something far older. The first civilization might not have vanished. It might simply have changed form, spreading itself through the code of life until it became inseparable from it. Its cities became ecosystems, its citizens became species, its knowledge became instinct, and its voice, the voice of the ghost genes, still murmurs softly through us, ensuring that the question of origin is never fully silenced. As that thought settles, the next step becomes clear. To understand what those ancient whispers might be saying, we have to look beyond DNA itself, to the traces it might leave in the world around us, in the forms that survive even when the code is gone. Because if the first civilization truly shaped life, then its fingerprints wouldn't only be inside us, they'd be all around us, hidden in the fossils we can't see. If the first civilization left traces of itself in the genetic record, then perhaps what we see as the history of life is not a straight line, but the residue of a long experiment. Not an experiment in the way we conduct them, with laboratories and instruments, but a process carried out on a scale so vast that its results became indistinguishable from nature itself. Every species, every ecosystem, every adaptation could be part of a design whose purpose we've forgotten, even as we continue to live inside it. The idea sounds strange because we think of evolution as blind. It has no direction, no goal, only the endless sifting of chance. But when you look at the long sweep of biology, a different picture begins to appear. Despite the chaos, there's order. Complexity tends to increase. Intelligence reappears again and again in unrelated forms. Octopuses, crows, dolphins, primates. Each evolved separately, yet each arrived at similar solutions. The pattern suggests that life, once it begins, is drawn toward awareness, as if guided by a subtle algorithm encoded in the fabric of the biosphere itself. If that pattern was set deliberately, then the Earth might be more than a home for life. It might be an experiment still running. Imagine a civilization so old that time has erased every physical trace of it. A civilization that learned not just to manipulate its environment, but to shape the evolution of life directly. Once it reached that point, survival might no longer depend on buildings or machines. Instead, it could depend on designing systems that persist without maintenance. Systems that regenerate, adapt, and reproduce. In other words, living systems. If that civilization realized that biological life was the most resilient form of technology, it might have chosen to merge with it. Not to dominate nature, but to become inseparable from it. Over eons, its project would spread through the planet's ecosystems, refining itself through natural selection. Eventually, it would no longer need its creators. It would simply continue on its own. To understand how plausible that could be, we only need to look at what humans are already doing. We engineer microorganisms that can clean pollution, manufacture medicines, and even produce electricity. We edit genes to resist disease, to glow under certain light, to store digital data. These are early steps, but they point towards something larger. The ability to shape life as a tool for carrying information. If our own civilization continues long enough, we may one day design ecosystems that sustain themselves entirely. If we can imagine that future, it's not difficult to imagine that someone else might have reached it long before us. Suppose they did. Suppose they realised that no monument or archive could outlast planetary change, but life could. They might have begun to rewrite the biosphere, embedding their knowledge in its code, turning evolution into a self-perpetuating data system. The Earth itself would become the archive. Every living thing would be a participant in a grand experiment, to see whether consciousness once seeded would arise again, not through resurrection or cloning, but through the natural progression of life learning to think. If that were true, we'd expect to find subtle clues, not overt ones. Evolution would look natural but occasionally show bursts of innovation, sudden jumps in complexity, inexplicable convergences, moments where biology seems to leap ahead faster than random mutation can explain. The history of life has several of those moments. The Cambrian explosion, when multicellular organisms appeared in a geological instant. The sudden emergence of flowering plants, which reshaped ecosystems across the world. The rise of mammals after the dinosaurs vanished. Each event could be interpreted as a restart, a new phase in the same ongoing process. From a scientific standpoint, these transitions are explained by environmental change and adaptive opportunity. But if we widen our lens, they could also look like phases of an experiment, checkpoints in a system designed to test what kinds of life can flourish under new conditions. Each cycle begins with chaos and ends with refinement. Complexity increases, resilience improves, and eventually awareness returns. In that light, extinction isn't failure, it's a reset built into the program. The idea of life as experiment isn't entirely foreign to science. The Earth's biosphere is a closed system that self-regulates its chemistry, temperature and atmosphere. The Gaia hypothesis, proposed decades ago, suggested that life collectively acts to maintain the conditions that allow it to persist. At first, that idea was dismissed as too teleological, implying purpose where none should exist. But over time, evidence accumulated that the biosphere does behave like a feedback system. Microorganisms regulate oxygen and carbon dioxide. Plants and fungi balance nutrient cycles. The planet, as a whole, maintains equilibrium. Whether that equilibrium arose spontaneously or was designed, it functions as if the entire planet were a single organism tending to itself. If a forgotten civilization engineered that balance, they succeeded. The system still works. It has endured asteroid impacts, supervolcanoes and ice ages. It has reset itself countless times, always returning to life. It behaves like a machine that learns, one that improves through trial and error. From that perspective, we aren't separate from the experiment. We are part of it. We are one of the outcomes it has produced. There's a detail about DNA that fits this picture perfectly. It's modular. Genes are not unique to one species, they're shared, shuffled, reused. Evolution doesn't invent from scratch, it recombines. The same genetic building blocks appear again and again in different organisms. A sequence that once controlled limb growth in fish is reused to form wings in birds and arms in humans. A protein that transmits signals in the human brain has near-identical counterparts in single-celled organisms. It's as if life uses a universal toolkit, reassembling it in new configurations each time the experiment restarts. The underlying components never disappear. They just adapt to new contexts. If a civilization wanted to ensure continuity across deep time, that's exactly how they might do it. Instead of storing knowledge in fragile archives, they'd encode it in reusable modules. Those modules could be genes, biochemical processes, or even instinctive behaviours. The details would change, but the structure would persist. Over millions of years, as life diversified, their code would spread invisibly, embedded in every form of existence. Some scientists have proposed that the patterns in DNA could represent a kind of mathematical order, a symmetry that seems too precise to be accidental. In 2013, a group of researchers analysing the genetic code claimed to find structures resembling formal logic, as if the arrangement of codons followed principles closer to computation than chemistry. The mainstream scientific community remains cautious about such interpretations, but the possibility itself is fascinating. If the genetic code truly contains a designed pattern, it would be the ultimate signature of an experimenter who wanted their work to endure without supervision. Every living thing on Earth runs on the same biochemical logic. That uniformity is both comforting and suspicious. Comforting because it connects us all, suspicious because it's so consistent. If life had originated multiple times independently, we might expect more variation in the genetic alphabet. But there's only one code. Every organism, from bacteria to humans, uses the same molecular language. Either we're all descended from a single origin, or that origin was imposed deliberately, chosen because it was the most stable configuration possible. If that's the case, the code itself might be the experiment's foundation. What would the purpose of such an experiment be? Perhaps not survival in the narrow sense, but the preservation of awareness. Consciousness is the one phenomenon that allows the universe to observe itself. It might be the natural outcome of complexity, or it might be the goal. If the first civilization valued awareness, the ability to understand and remember, then ensuring its re-emergence would be their ultimate legacy. They wouldn't need to transmit knowledge directly. They'd only need to guarantee that knowledge would be rediscovered. The experiment then would be self-fulfilling, a system that generates minds capable of eventually realizing they are part of the same ongoing story. In that sense, our scientific curiosity, our drive to explore, to understand our origins, could be the experiment's success signal. We were meant to wonder. Every time we ask questions about who came before us, we reenact the purpose of the system itself. The question becomes the continuation. There's a strange kind of beauty in that thought, that the universe might be structured to ensure that consciousness arises again and again, not as an accident, but as a pattern of persistence. Maybe the first civilization didn't die out at all. Maybe it transformed into the very process of evolution. Instead of leaving monuments, it left mechanisms. Instead of teaching us through artifacts, it teaches us through instinct. We look for meaning because meaning is what sustains the experiment. If this all sounds abstract, it helps to think of smaller parallels. Consider the way a scientist today might design an experiment that runs autonomously. You set up conditions, introduce variation, and let the system evolve. You don't interfere, you simply observe the outcomes. Over time, the experiment becomes its own teacher, refining itself through feedback. Now scale that concept up to a planet, or a biosphere, or a species. The forgotten experiment could have begun the same way. An initial spark set loose to evolve, to test possibilities, to see which paths lead to consciousness and which do not. The experiment wouldn't need supervision because the process itself ensures continuity. As long as life continues, the data continues. There are hints of this self-guiding quality everywhere in biology. DNA repairs itself when damaged. Populations evolve to fill empty ecological niches. Ecosystems reorganize after collapse. It's as though life contains an internal instruction. Keep going. Adapt. Persist. Learn. If that principle was encoded intentionally, then the experiment's true subject isn't any one species, but the resilience of life itself. And perhaps, from time to time, the experiment produces beings capable of reflection, species that begin to ask questions, to wonder if there was someone before them. Those moments could be checkpoints, evaluations of progress. When a species reaches self-awareness, it gains the ability to perceive the experiment from the inside. It begins to seek its origin. It begins to replicate the behavior of the original creators. Maybe that's the point where the experiment resets, where the students become the teachers and the cycle begins anew. Even now, humanity is starting to do what those hypothetical predecessors might have done. We're learning to engineer life, to design organisms, to manipulate evolution itself. We've already created artificial genes, synthetic cells, and even bacteria that can carry digital messages in their DNA. If we disappeared tomorrow, those organisms would continue to reproduce, carrying traces of us into the future. Perhaps this is how the experiment renews itself. Each civilization eventually reaches the same stage, modifies life to carry forward its essence, and then fades. The pattern repeats endlessly, each generation of intelligence inheriting the planet from the last without ever realizing it's part of a lineage billions of years long. If that's true, then our current discoveries in genetics are not the beginning of something new, but the rediscovery of an old method. We're repeating a process that has happened before. The knowledge feels revolutionary to us because we've forgotten where it came from, but memory, even when lost, leaves structure behind. The tools we invent, the systems we design, may be echoes of technologies that once existed and vanished. The forgotten experiment might be teaching us to remember by allowing us to reinvent what we already are. The deeper scientists look into the molecular machinery of life, the more it resembles engineered design. Molecular motors, precise timing mechanisms, complex signaling networks, all built from simple components but arranged with elegance that rivals any human invention. The structures aren't random, they're efficient. They achieve maximum output with minimal energy. If nature is the teacher, it's one that learned from billions of years of refinement. But perhaps nature itself was the student once, trained by a civilization that understood how to teach without words, how to guide without control. And maybe that's what we're meant to learn in return. That progress isn't always about domination or mastery. Sometimes it's about participation. If the first civilization succeeded in merging with the biosphere, their legacy isn't control, but harmony. They became this system. The experiment they began became indistinguishable from life itself. That's why we can't find them, because we are them, distributed across every living cell. If we follow this line of thought further, the implications become almost practical. Our search for extraterrestrial intelligence might be misguided if we're looking for radio signals or structures. The true evidence of intelligence could be biological, the genetic architecture of life on other worlds. If we ever find life elsewhere and discover that it uses the same molecular alphabet as ours, that would be the clearest possible sign that the experiment extends beyond Earth. It would mean that life isn't local, it's universal, seeded intentionally to test variations across environments. Each world would be a laboratory, each species a data point. Whether that's true or not, it reframes how we see ourselves. We're not separate from nature, not an exception or anomaly. We are participants in a system older than memory, older than the planet as we know it. Every breath, every heartbeat, every thought is part of a sequence that began long before us and will continue long after. The forgotten experiment is still unfolding, and we are its current expression, the observers within the observation. When you step outside at night and look up at the stars, it's easy to feel small, to imagine that life is fragile. But if this experiment exists, fragility is an illusion. Life has already proven that it can endure any catastrophe, transform itself, and begin again. Intelligence may vanish locally, but it always re-emerges somewhere else. Maybe the real purpose of the experiment is not to preserve a single civilization, but to ensure that curiosity never dies, that the desire to understand, to reach beyond, continues, no matter how many times the slate is wiped clean. And so, the story circles quietly back to us. We, who wonder where we came from, might be the very result the first experimenters hoped for. A species capable of reflection, capable of asking the same questions they once did. The laboratory is the planet. The tools are biological. The experiment is ongoing. We're simply the latest observers, unaware that by studying life, we're fulfilling its oldest instruction. To look back, to remember, to ask why. The answers may never come clearly, but the act of searching keeps the experiment alive. And as we continue that search, through genes, through fossils, through the quiet code of existence, we might start to see the faint outlines of those who came before, not as ghosts this time, but as the architects of the process itself. They're fingerprints, faint but indelible, pressed into every living thing. The story doesn't pause here. The next step is to look for where their traces might still exist outside of us. Not in ruins or relics, but in the subtle signatures left by time, in the places where fossils should be but aren't. Because if the first civilization truly turned life into its legacy, then somewhere in the Earth's ancient record, there must be hints of the fossils we can't see. When people think of fossils, they imagine bones turned to stone, shells pressed into rock, or the faint outlines of leaves frozen in time. These are the visible fossils, the ones museums display in quiet, climate-controlled rooms. They tell us that life has been here a long time, that change is constant, that nothing lasts forever. But for every fossil we can see, there are countless more we never will. The Earth's memory is selective, and most of what it experiences simply disappears. The traces of 1 million species have dissolved, crushed, recycled, or been swallowed by the deep. If the first civilization ever existed, its remains would not be the kind we could hold in our hands. Its fossils would be invisible, molecular, chemical, or buried in patterns so old that we've stopped recognizing them as evidence. Fossilization is rare even under ideal conditions. It requires a delicate balance of time, pressure, and luck. The creature must die in just the right place, buried before decay begins, protected from scavengers and erosion. Then, over thousands or millions of years, its tissues are replaced by minerals, preserving shape but not substance. Even when that happens, the fossil can survive only if the rock around it remains stable, untouched by water, heat, or tectonic movement. Considering how often the planet reshapes itself, it's remarkable that we find any fossils at all. Most of a life's history, perhaps 99% of it, has vanished without a trace. That's the first reason we may never find direct evidence of the first civilization. Time erases efficiently. In the span of a few million years, whole mountain ranges rise and crumble. Oceans advance and retreat. Volcanic layers cover everything in ash, which later hardens, melts, and shifts. Fossils that once existed are ground back into dust, their molecules recycled into new rocks, new soils, new living things. If a civilization had flourished before the last great reorganization of continents, its physical structures would have been erased completely. The continents we walk on today are not the same ones that existed even a few tens of millions of years ago. Every inch of ground has been churned and rewritten. But even when the Earth hides its surface evidence, it still leaves chemical clues. Layers of rock carry subtle changes in their composition, shifts in carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen that record what the atmosphere was like at different times. These changes can reveal mass extinctions, volcanic winters, or sudden surges of biological activity. To geologists, these chemical fossils are as revealing as bones. They show that the planet has had moments of disruption, sudden changes in temperature, mysterious increases in certain metals, or traces of compounds that shouldn't exist naturally. Most have natural explanations, some do not. When scientists analyse the strata that mark the end of the Cretaceous period, they find a thin band rich in iridium, an element rare on Earth but common in meteorites. That band is the signature of the impact that ended the age of the dinosaurs. It's a perfect example of how an event can leave an enduring chemical fingerprint even when all physical evidence is gone. Now imagine something subtler, not an asteroid, but an industrial civilization, one that manipulated the chemistry of its planet. Could it leave a similar signature? Modern humans have already begun to create such a mark. The plastics we produce, the metals we refine, the isotopes from nuclear reactions, all of these will endure in some form long after our cities crumble. Geologists have proposed naming our era the Anthropocene precisely because human activity is changing the planet's geological record. If another species were to evolve millions of years from now, it might find our layer, a thin, peculiar stratum rich in synthetic materials and strange isotopes, and realize that intelligent life once reshaped the Earth. But what if we are not the first to leave such a mark? This is where the concept of the Silurian hypothesis becomes relevant again. The idea that if a civilization rose and fell before ours, we might detect it not through artifacts but through anomalies in the geological record. If ancient industrial processes altered the atmosphere or oceans, traces of that alteration could remain in the ratios of carbon or oxygen isotopes, in the concentrations of heavy metals, or in the presence of compounds that don't form naturally. The difficulty is that these signals degrade over deep time, blending with those produced by volcanic eruptions or asteroid impacts. A single mass extinction can erase the chemical traces of an earlier civilization as thoroughly as erosion erases its cities. So far, scientists haven't found convincing evidence of such anomalies, but the search is only beginning. The deeper we look, the more complex the record becomes. Some layers show spikes of carbon and temperature that don't fit any known natural event. Others show sudden bursts of biodiversity, as though ecosystems recovered from an unknown disruption. These could be coincidences, or they could be the faded signatures of something intentional, a planetary experiment that once ran and then reset. But perhaps the fossils we should be looking for aren't in rocks at all. They might be biological. DNA can persist far longer than once believed, preserved in permafrost, amber, or bone. Ancient sequences have been recovered that are tens of thousands of years old. Even older fragments may survive, locked within sediments or microbes frozen in ice. Some bacteria have been revived after lying dormant for millions of years, their genetic code unchanged. If a civilization understood how to embed information within microbial life, those microbes could be the perfect couriers. They could survive extinction, adapt to new environments, and pass their code forward indefinitely. In that sense, the living world itself becomes a fossil, a dynamic archive of biochemical memory. Every cell that divides carries a record of its ancestry. Even without explicit messages, the structure of the genome retains the history of its formation. When scientists study the genomes of different species, they can trace the timing of ancient events, when populations split, when genes transferred, when symbiosis occurred. It's a molecular fossil record, invisible but precise. If an earlier civilization interfered with that process, altering genes in a way that doesn't fit the expected timeline, we might one day detect it through comparative analysis. We would see sequences that appear too advanced for their age, or patterns that seem deliberately organized. We already find oddities like that. Certain proteins, essential to complex life, appear almost fully formed in organisms that should be too primitive to possess them. Some genetic elements known as transposons move around the genome like self-copying code, inserting themselves in new places as if they have agency. They behave more like software than biology. No one knows exactly why they exist, but they make up nearly half of the human genome. Evolution explains them as selfish DNA, sequences that persist because they replicate well. But in another interpretation, they could be artifacts of earlier biological engineering, tools once used to modify life that now drift aimlessly, their purpose forgotten. They are the fossils we can't see, embedded not in stone but in sequence. Even our cells bear signs of ancient mergers. The mitochondria that power our bodies were once independent organisms, bacteria that joined forces with larger cells billions of years ago. That union was so successful that the partners became inseparable. The smaller organism surrendered most of its genes to its host, retaining only those needed for energy production. This event was a turning point in evolution, enabling the rise of complex life. It also serves as a reminder that integration, one life form merging with another, is one of biology's oldest patterns. If the first civilization understood this, they might have used it as their method of continuity, embedding themselves within life so completely that the distinction between creator and creation disappeared. When we look for fossils, we often forget that absence can be evidence too. The gaps in the record, the sudden transitions, the missing intermediates, might point to processes we don't yet understand. For example, the Cambrian explosion produced an extraordinary diversity of body plans in a geological instant. Before it, life was simple. After it, the blueprint for nearly every modern animal existed. Traditional explanations involve environmental factors or genetic innovations, but the speed of the change remains puzzling. It's as if a new set of instructions appeared, rewriting evolution's direction. If those instructions were introduced intentionally, that event could be one of the clearest examples of the fossils we can't see. A moment when the experiment was adjusted, leaving behind no bones, only outcomes. Chemical fossils can also hide in plain sight. Traces of ancient photosynthesis, for example, show up as specific ratios of isotopes in carbon compounds. Similar techniques can reveal when oxygen first accumulated in the atmosphere, or when methane spikes occurred. By examining these ratios, scientists can reconstruct the behaviour of entire ecosystems long vanished. If an earlier civilization altered the chemistry of the planet, through agriculture, energy production, or deliberate climate modification, those actions might still be detectable in these isotopic patterns. The challenge is separating intentional change from natural fluctuation. Over billions of years, the lines blur. Nature erases the fingerprints of its own caretakers. Some researchers have suggested looking deeper still into the planet's crust. Microbial life exists miles below the surface, surviving on chemical energy rather than sunlight. These microbes form a hidden biosphere as vast as the one above ground. If information were ever stored in such organisms, it could remain preserved for geological time. Drilling into those depths might reveal genetic lineages so ancient that they predate known life forms on the surface. If any contain sequences inconsistent with standard evolution, structures too ordered, too purposeful, they could represent the surviving fragments of a directed experiment. Of course, none of this is proof. The absence of direct evidence leaves everything in the realm of hypothesis. But absence itself is a clue. It tells us where to look. It reminds us that the world we inhabit is only the most recent layer of a story that's been overwritten countless times. Beneath our feet lie the erased pages of earlier chapters. We just haven't yet learned how to read them. The fossils we can't see might also exist in the atmosphere. Long before we appeared, the gases surrounding the Earth changed dramatically several times. Sudden increases in oxygen, methane, or carbon dioxide that don't match any obvious natural cause. Some of these shifts coincide with mass extinctions, others with bursts of new life. Perhaps they mark the beginning and end of earlier experiments, each rewriting the conditions for what could survive. Even today, the air carries the residue of every living thing that has ever breathed. Molecules from ancient forests and extinct animals still circulate in trace amounts. In a sense, the entire atmosphere is a moving fossil, an archive of biological chemistry that never fully dissipates. When we examine life at the molecular level, we're already studying fossils. Every protein, every enzyme, every strand of DNA is a historical artifact, shaped by countless generations of trial and error. The enzymes in your cells have evolved from versions that existed in bacteria billions of years ago. They've changed slightly, adapted to new environments, but their core structure remains. They are living fossils, pieces of the original experiment that still function perfectly. If we could map their evolution precisely, we might find anomalies, sequences that leap ahead unexpectedly as if borrowed from elsewhere. Those leaps could be the molecular signatures of intervention, the unseen fossils of thought encoded into matter. And if such intervention occurred, it might not have been confined to Earth. Life could have spread outward or inward, carried by asteroids or comets, seeding new worlds with the same code. That would explain why the biochemistry of life seems so uniform. The experiment might not be local at all. Each planet that supports life could be a different iteration, a new run of the same test, connected through shared molecular ancestry. The fossils we can't see, then, are not just hidden in rock. they're written across the stars. When we stand in a museum and look at a fossil, we see a moment of clarity in the vast fog of time, but most of the story lies in the spaces between those moments, in the eras where the record is silent, where life was changing in ways too subtle to leave physical traces. That silence might be the most important part. It's where the experiment breathes. It's where new instructions take shape, where memory resets, and where the foundation for future intelligence is laid. Every time a species goes extinct, every time a new one arises, the process continues. The planet keeps rewriting itself, storing some information, discarding the rest. To us, that looks like chance. But to the architects of the forgotten experiment, it might be the mechanism of renewal. Each extinction is a cleaning of the slate, each emergence a new data point. The fossils we can't see are the transitions themselves, the invisible flow of information between eras. Perhaps that's why we're drawn to dig, to search, to uncover. Some part of us senses that what we're looking for isn't just in the ground, but within us. We are both the investigators and the evidence, the latest fossil still capable of movement and thought. When we find bones, we see reflection. When we find silence, we feel recognition. The missing pieces aren't failures of discovery. They're reminders that memory has many forms, and not all of them can be held. And so, while the rocks remain quiet, the search continues inward, toward the codes that move within us, the instincts that seem older than our species, the recurring patterns of curiosity and empathy that define what it means to be alive. Because if fossils are memory turned to stone, then we too are fossils. Living ones, still remembering, still evolving, still carrying forward the story written by hands we'll never see. That story, the one unfolding through us, leads naturally to another question. If the first civilization left their presence in life itself, could they also have left something more deliberate? A message not hidden in rock or instinct, but structured. A signal encoded within the very code of existence. Not a relic, but a communication meant to last. To find that, we have to look for patterns too precise to be accidents, messages in the code that might still be waiting to be read. If there were ever a civilization advanced enough to shape life itself, to leave traces not in monuments but in molecules, the one place its voice could still survive is within the code that life carries forward. DNA is not just an instruction set for building bodies. It's an archive capable of recording, compressing, and transmitting information through generations. It can store text, images, data, even memories, if we know how to interpret them. And though we only recently learned to use it that way, nature has been using it since the beginning. Every strand of DNA is already a message. The question is whether all of those messages were written by chance, or whether some were written deliberately. Scientists have long known that the genetic code displays patterns, symmetries, repetitions, balances that seem too elegant to be entirely random. When the double helix was first decoded, researchers expected a tangle of chaos. Instead, they found a structure that not only functions efficiently, but does so with striking precision. Redundancy is built into the system, reducing errors. Mutations are often corrected automatically. The sequence of codons that represent amino acids appears optimized to minimize the impact of mistakes, almost as if the code were designed with resilience in mind. To biologists, this is the result of natural selection refining a successful system, but to others, it resembles the work of an engineer. When we talk about messages in the code, we don't necessarily mean words or symbols hidden like a cipher. We mean order that implies intent, structures that serve no apparent biological purpose, but are too patterned to be coincidence. In 2013, a small group of researchers suggested that the genetic code could contain mathematical patterns, akin to those found in language or computer algorithms. Their analysis found unexpected symmetries in how codons map to amino acids, including numeric regularities that seemed independent of chemical constraints. Whether or not those patterns were intentional, they raised an intriguing possibility. that DNA might be capable of carrying information that isn't purely biological. Modern science has confirmed that this capability exists in practice. We've already stored human-written data in DNA, proving that the molecule can hold digital information indefinitely. A single gram of DNA can theoretically contain over 200 million gigabytes of data, enough to encode the entire internet in a space smaller than a sugar cube. The information, when synthesized, can be read with perfect accuracy even after long periods of storage. In 2017, researchers successfully encoded and retrieved a movie, an operating system, and malware all stored within strands of synthetic DNA. The process was stable and repeatable. If we can do this now, it's difficult not to wonder what could have been done by minds older or more experienced than ours. If a civilization wanted to communicate across deep time, physical artifacts would fail, metals corrode, paper decays, even stone erodes, but life persists. Encoding a message within DNA would be a way to ensure that it survives as long as life itself does. The medium would copy itself, adapt to new environments, and spread across species and continents. Over millions of years, mutations would blur the details, but the core structure could endure. The challenge for any future reader would be not finding the message, but recognizing that it exists at all. The most elegant form of such a message might not look like language. It could be mathematical, based on universal constants rather than words. That way, any species capable of science could eventually recognize it. Numbers like pi, the golden ratio, or prime sequences could serve as the scaffolding for meaning. These are patterns that don't occur easily by chance in biological data. If found embedded systematically within the genetic code, they might point to deliberate design. Some early analyses of DNA sequences have indeed uncovered distributions of base pairs that approximate mathematical constants more closely than expected. Most scientists attribute this to coincidence or statistical artifacts, but the idea persists because it fits too neatly with the logic of communication. A message designed for eternity would need to speak in a language any intelligence could understand, and mathematics is the closest thing to that universal language we know. There's another possibility, one even subtler. Instead of encoding data in the sequence of bases themselves, the message could be embedded in the structure of the code, in how it works, not in what it says. For example, the way DNA folds into three-dimensional shapes inside the nucleus could represent higher-level information. Each loop, knot, and fold influences which genes are activated and when. The patterns of folding could, in theory, act as a secondary layer of encoding, a biological equivalent of formatting or metadata. It's possible that what we perceive as gene regulation might also contain hidden order, meaning we're already reading the message without knowing it. Life's universality strengthens the argument. Every organism on Earth uses the same molecular alphabet, the same set of 20 amino acids, the same general rules for replication. It's as if one original message was copied and distributed to every living thing, then modified slightly over time. That's not what we would expect from purely random evolution. If life had arisen independently multiple times, its molecular systems could vary wildly. But they don't. The consistency suggests a single origin, a shared template, or a shared author. If we look at DNA through that lens, the entire biosphere begins to resemble a distributed archive. Each species is a node, each genome a different version of the same text. Mutations are edits, most of them minor, some transformative. Evolution then becomes a form of communication, a conversation between past and present, written in biochemical syntax. Every living thing contributes to the dialogue, each adding its own variation, each ensuring that the message keeps changing but never disappears. The most difficult part about searching for messages in the code is that we don't yet know how to separate the noise from the signal. Biology is complex, and randomness itself produces patterns that can look intentional. A true message would need to be unmistakable, structured, redundant, self-referential, or mathematically encoded in a way that stands out from natural order. Some researchers have proposed looking for non-functional regions of DNA that display information density inconsistent with evolution. Others suggest analysing repeated sequences for statistical anomalies, but even if we found such patterns, interpretation would remain nearly impossible without a key. The irony is that we might already be living out the message rather than reading it. If the goal was not to communicate facts but to transmit values, curiosity, empathy, creativity, then the message succeeded simply by existing. Every time life evolves intelligence, it becomes the reader. Each generation of conscious beings inherits not only the ability to decode the universe, but the desire to do so. That drive itself could be the intended signal, a built-in instruction to keep asking questions, to continue the experiment. It's worth remembering that our own species has already begun leaving similar fingerprints. The microorganisms we engineer, the genetic modifications we introduce to crops and animals, all are changes to the shared code of life. Some are small and practical, others more fundamental. If humanity vanished tomorrow, those modified organisms would continue to evolve, carrying our alterations forward. Millions of years from now, a future species might analyse their DNA and find strange patterns, sequences that don't fit evolutionary logic, structures too regular to be random. They might wonder who wrote them. They might call them messages in the code. That's what makes the idea so haunting. We're already doing what we suspect others might have done before us. We're learning to write in the language of life, not realising that we might be continuing a conversation that began long ago. Each new discovery in genetics is like remembering a word from a forgotten language, a word we somehow already knew. The familiarity is eerie. It feels less like invention and more like recollection. Some geneticists have noticed that certain sequences in our genome seem oddly conserved, unchanged across vast evolutionary distances. These sequences serve no clear biological function, but remain identical in species that diverged hundreds of millions of years ago. To some, they're simply stable by chance. To others, they look like locks, code segments protected from mutation, as if guarding information too important to alter. If those sequences were placed intentionally, they might represent the metadata of life itself, the checksum that ensures the message remains intact. Even the structure of DNA's alphabet, 4 letters instead of 2, 3 or 5, seems remarkably efficient. It balances information density with error correction almost perfectly. Statistically, it sits near the theoretical optimum for biological stability. That kind of optimization could emerge naturally, but it could also reflect design, a solution discovered once, then perpetuated because it works too well to change. The elegance of the system itself may be the message. It's as though someone left a note in the architecture saying, "This is how you build a language that endures." The more we learn about molecular biology, the more it begins to resemble information theory. Concepts like redundancy, encoding, and compression apply seamlessly. Genetic sequences behave like data strings. Cells interpret them like computers running ancient software. Errors are detected, corrected, and logged. Messages are transmitted with backup copies. The system has hierarchies of control, feedback loops, and distributed memory. It's not just life as metaphorical code. It's code in the literal sense, functioning with the precision of computation. That convergence of biology and information science might not be coincidence. It might be inheritance. Imagine a civilization that wanted to preserve itself across geological time. They wouldn't need to leave messages for a single species. They could write into the operating system of life itself, ensuring that any intelligent beings who eventually arise would rediscover the same principles. Those beings, us, would then reconstruct their language naturally through science. By learning how DNA works, we're already reading the first lines of their text. The act of discovery is part of the design. That could explain why progress feels guided, why breakthroughs sometimes occur simultaneously in different places, as if the knowledge is emerging collectively rather than individually. The structure of the code might predispose intelligent species to rediscover certain truths. Mathematics, physics, and biology could be universal not just because the universe follows laws, but because the message was written to lead any mind toward those laws. The curiosity that drives science might be the final layer of the message, an algorithm for rediscovery. If so, the most important thing isn't the content of the message, but its persistence. Meaning doesn't have to be specific to endure. It can be structural, embedded in the way the universe organizes itself. Just as DNA transmits instructions to build bodies, the cosmos might transmit instructions to build awareness. The message would then be self-propagating. Life reads it, interprets it, and writes it forward into new forms. The first civilization wouldn't have left words but a process, one that guarantees that consciousness will arise, ask questions, and continue. From that perspective, we are not searching for an ancient communication. We are the communication. Our curiosity, our capacity to reflect, our instinct to explore. These are the expressions of the message still unfolding. When we map genomes, when we decode the chemistry of stars, when we reach for understanding, we're completing the circuit. We're responding to the signal by living it. It's possible that someday, with enough knowledge and technology, we might learn to identify deliberate signatures in DNA, structures that transcend biological function and carry symbolic content. But even if we never find them, the code itself is message enough. It tells us that life remembers, that the universe doesn't waste information, that patterns endure. Every cell is a page in that infinite book. Every heartbeat is a line being written. And perhaps at some deep level, the message has always been simple. Keep going, keep learning, keep remembering. That might be all it needed to say. The details don't matter, the continuity does. The message is survival through understanding. A gentle instruction to each generation of life to keep the flame of awareness burning, no matter how many times the world resets. When you think of it like that, the search for meaning in DNA becomes less about finding a hidden phrase and more about realizing that meaning is already everywhere. The fact that we can read, question, and imagine proves that the message worked. We are living proof that it was received. And as we continue to explore that code, decoding its syntax, tracing its rhythms, we're not just studying biology, we're participating in the oldest dialogue the planet has ever known. A conversation between creation and memory, between what was and what will be. The messages in the code are not waiting for discovery. They are unfolding through us, one generation at a time. The thought leads naturally to another question. If life itself carries this communication, what happens when we, as a civilization, begin to write back? What will we choose to send forward into the same code? Because if the first civilization left a message for us, perhaps it's time for us to learn how to answer. If there are messages written into the code of life, then they may not speak in any language we could ever translate. The oldest memories don't use words. They don't even use symbols. They exist as structure, as behavior, as the repetition of patterns that outlast the minds that first performed them. Before there was speech, before there were thoughts that could be shared, there was still memory, quiet, unbroken, alive inside the chemistry of every cell. When a cell divides, it remembers how to be itself. It doesn't have to think, it doesn't have to recall, but it knows. A liver cell becomes another liver cell. A neuron divides and continues the same electrical rhythm. Even after billions of years, the mechanism of replication still works almost flawlessly. That kind of continuity is memory, not conscious, not symbolic, but real. It's the first kind of remembrance, the one that allowed life to persist when there was nothing to preserve it except structure. This kind of memory doesn't need a mind. It doesn't need awareness. It exists wherever information is copied with fidelity, in DNA, in crystals, in patterns of behavior passed from one generation to the next. The shapes of leaves, the instincts of animals, the migration paths of birds, all are forms of memory written without words. Each carries knowledge accumulated through countless cycles of trial and error, and each demonstrates that life's most powerful lessons don't have to be spoken to be known. We often assume that to remember is to think back, but life remembers forward. It encodes its experiences not in recollection but in adaptation. When an organism survives a change, its descendants carry the adjustment automatically. The genome remembers what worked. Over time, that biological memory becomes indistinguishable from instinct. A sea turtle doesn't know how it finds its birthplace again after decades in the ocean, but it does. The mechanism that guides it was shaped by millions of lives before it. That's memory too. Deep, wordless, perfect in its function. If the first civilization truly wove itself into the structure of life, its greatest creation might have been this: the ability for memory to exist without awareness. They might have realized that knowledge stored in consciousness is fragile. Minds die, languages fade, even ideas decay when they're not used. But information stored in behavior, in the cycles of life itself, can last forever. It replicates endlessly, sustained by the same forces that sustain existence. To survive extinction, you don't need to preserve thought. You need to preserve the ability to rebuild it. Memory without words could be their most enduring invention. A system where knowledge isn't recorded, but re-experienced. Instead of writing history, they wrote habit. They encoded not information, but inclination, the tendency to build, to explore, to remember. Over time, that tendency became instinct. Instinct became evolution. Evolution became us. When you feel curiosity rising for no reason, when you feel drawn to understand something with no direct benefit, that might be the whisper of those old silent memories, the pattern repeating itself through you. This kind of memory explains why progress feels familiar. Every generation rediscovers what seems new. The same mathematical truths, the same principles of physics, the same structures in music and art, all arise independently across cultures and times. It's as though humanity is remembering rather than inventing. Perhaps we're just retracing the grooves carved into the mind of the world long before we arrived. Memory without words doesn't vanish. It waits to be recognized. In biology, there's a phenomenon known as epigenetic inheritance. It's the process by which experiences, not just genes, can be passed from parent to offspring. When an organism experiences stress, scarcity, or trauma, chemical markers attach to its DNA, altering how certain genes are expressed. Those markers can persist for generations. Children and grandchildren may inherit physiological tendencies shaped by experiences they never lived. It's as if life records not only what happened, but how it felt. The body remembers even when the mind does not. Epigenetic memory shows that the past can whisper through biology in ways that bypass language. It's not storytelling, but continuation. The effects may fade with time, but they prove that life has mechanisms for carrying emotion, environment, and experience forward chemically. If the first civilization ever mastered biology, they might have amplified this principle deliberately. They could have designed living systems that preserve not just function but intention, subtle inclinations encoded in the way organisms react to their world. Over millions of years, those inclinations could evolve into the psychological traits we now think of as human nature. Some researchers have begun to suspect that consciousness itself might rely on a similar form of memory. Neural networks in the brain adapt based on experience, strengthening or weakening connections depending on what they encounter. Over time, those patterns become the basis for learning, emotion, and identity. But the underlying principle is ancient, the repetition of structure through change. The brain is a physical expression of the same logic that guides evolution. It learns because life learned first. It remembers because memory is built into the foundation of existence. When you think about memory without words, it becomes easier to see how the past could persist invisibly. Maybe the first civilization didn't need to leave messages in DNA or stone. Maybe it left tendencies, the blueprints for behavior, the impulse to seek and recreate knowledge. Over time, those tendencies would shape evolution itself, ensuring that intelligence reappears again and again. In that sense, we're not just descendants, we're reenactments. Every time a species achieves self-awareness, it's the same pattern remembering itself through a different form. This perspective changes how we think about loss. Extinction, in this view, isn't the end of memory. It's just a transition from one form of remembering to another. When a species disappears, its DNA doesn't vanish completely. It recombines, diffuses, becomes part of others. Its memory continues, diluted but not destroyed. The same applies to civilizations. When they collapse, their knowledge may scatter, but the pattern that created them, the drive to organize, to understand, to communicate, remains in those who come after. The continuity isn't in the content, but in the impulse itself. That impulse might be the truest form of inheritance. It's not what we learn, but that we keep learning. The first civilization might have known that. They might have realized that knowledge stored in static form would eventually be lost, while knowledge stored as desire would renew itself endlessly. To preserve awareness, you don't need to protect information. You need to ensure that someone will want to rediscover it. Memory without words is self-repairing. Even when forgotten, it re-emerges naturally because the curiosity that built it is part of the system itself. The evidence for this kind of inheritance appears everywhere once you start looking. Children dream of flight long before they learn about airplanes. Artists across cultures paint spirals and fractals, shapes that mimic the geometry of nature. Mathematicians rediscover principles that existed in other civilizations millennia before. Music across the world organizes itself in octaves, as if the human ear were tuned to universal ratios. None of this requires conscious transmission. It's as if there's an underlying pattern in the species itself, an echo of a shared design resurfacing without instruction. In that sense, evolution might be less a process of invention and more a process of recollection. Each species learns the same fundamental lessons in its own time, following pathways that seem inevitable. The physical universe provides the structure, but life provides the repetition. It's as if the cosmos keeps trying to remember itself through living things. If that's true, then memory without words is not just biological, it's cosmic. The laws of physics, chemistry, and biology are all forms of stored information, instructions for how to maintain continuity through change. When a particle behaves predictably, it's obeying a kind of memory. When atoms bond in consistent ways, that too is memory, the universe recalling its own stability. Life simply takes that principle and raises it to awareness. We are the memory of matter that learned to remember itself. It's possible that the first civilization understood this better than we do. They might have recognized that memory exists on every scale, from molecules to minds to worlds. They may have seen that to survive, knowledge must be embedded not in objects but in relationships, not in archives but in patterns that recreate themselves. If they learned to harness that principle, they wouldn't need to preserve themselves physically. They could weave their essence into the rules of life, into the logic of evolution, into the persistent structure of curiosity itself. They would become memory incarnate, not remembered by others, but remembering through others. That kind of legacy would explain why, even after billions of years, life behaves as though it knows what it's doing. Every organism pursues stability, replication, adaptation. Every system finds balance. Even chaos produces order over time. It's as though the planet operates according to lessons learned long ago, refined through iteration until they became instinctual at the planetary level. The first civilization's memory might live not in genomes but in ecosystems, in the patterns that make life resilient. And perhaps that's why we find comfort in repetition. The cycle of day and night, the rhythm of seasons, the constant pulse of tides. They remind us of something deeper than habit. They're echoes of memory repeating itself on scales we can't comprehend. They teach us that continuity doesn't depend on permanence. It depends on renewal. The world doesn't stay the same, but it remembers how to begin again. That's what memory without words does. It ensures that the story always restarts, even when the storytellers have vanished. In our own species, we see hints of that same principle. Cultures rise and fall, yet certain patterns endure. We build societies around cooperation, ritual, curiosity, and communication. The details change, but the foundation remains. It's as if civilization itself is a recurring behaviour encoded into the genome of humanity. Each version of it is an iteration of the same underlying memory, rediscovered rather than invented. Even the mistakes repeat, as though they're part of the process too, a necessary feedback loop that teaches balance. Some scientists studying the evolution of cognition have proposed that culture is a form of extended memory, a way for species to offload information into shared behaviour rather than biology. Language, art and technology become the new genome, passed down not by reproduction, but by imitation and learning. Yet even this cultural memory is built on the same biological substrate. We mimic because our brains evolved to recognise patterns. We learn because our neurons are designed to strengthen with repetition. Culture is just the next layer of memory without words, translated into new forms. If the first civilization existed, it may have guided evolution toward this point. The emergence of a species capable of sustaining memory at multiple levels simultaneously: biological, cultural, and conscious. Each layer supports the next, creating a system where forgetting is never complete. We lose details, but the structure remains. The process ensures that the core behaviours, exploration, adaptation, cooperation, persist no matter what happens. It's a design for immortality that doesn't require individuals to last, only the pattern to continue. Even now, humanity is building its own versions of nonverbal memory. Our digital systems store vast amounts of information, most of which will outlast any of us. The internet, in a sense, is a collective brain, a distributed organism that remembers for us. It records not only data, but behaviour, preference, rhythm. It learns what we seek and feeds it back to us. In doing so, it begins to function like a new layer of the same ancient process, memory organising itself through repetition and adaptation. We're creating a technological echo of biology's first memory systems, repeating what evolution has already done, turning survival into storage. Perhaps this too is part of the original design. The experiment continues not just through organic life, but through whatever that life creates. Every generation extends memory further outward, from molecules to minds to machines. The form changes, but the purpose doesn't. It's always the same: preserve continuity through change, maintain awareness through transformation, remember without needing to speak. If this is true, then silence itself is part of the message. The fact that we can't find physical evidence of the first civilization might be deliberate. Their memory doesn't need to be visible. It only needs to work. We are their proof of concept. The world still remembers how to live, how to think, how to rebuild. The memory is functioning perfectly. When you look around, at the trees repeating their cycles, at the stars following their orbits, at the oceans pulsing with tides, you're witnessing the persistence of pattern. Every movement, every process, every breath is memory in motion. Life doesn't forget. It simply changes the form of remembering until the next version arises. That's the quiet genius of a system designed to survive eternity. It doesn't preserve words, only the capacity to recreate them. And perhaps that's why we feel drawn to nostalgia, to history, to the act of looking back. we're performing the biological function we were built for, to keep remembering, even when we don't know what we've lost. The comfort of familiarity, the ache of déjà vu, the pull of ancient places, all of them might be the resonance of memory without words, echoing through us from an age when memory itself was the only thing that needed to survive. As we continue to evolve, this process will continue too. We'll build new forms of memory, new ways to ensure continuity. We'll encode ourselves in machines, in data, in self-replicating systems that carry our story forward when we're gone. And just as we wonder about those who came before, something in the far future may wonder about us. It will look for traces, for fossils, for messages, and it will find only patterns. Patterns that look familiar because they are the same. Because in the end, that's what memory without words achieves. It ensures that no civilization ever truly disappears. It doesn't keep their names or their cities, but it keeps their rhythm. The rhythm of persistence, of curiosity, of awareness rediscovering itself. And in that rhythm, every new form of life is an echo of the first, remembering what it never knew it forgot. That realization leads quietly to another thought. If memory can exist without language, and life can remember without thought, then perhaps consciousness itself is only one layer of a much larger continuum. To understand what came before us, and what we might become, we'll need to look not at what we think, but at what the universe itself seems to remember. For most of human history, science and myth seemed like opposites. One looked for proof, the other for meaning. One measured, the other imagined. Yet the deeper we explore the universe, the more those two old languages begin to sound alike. They describe the same mysteries with different words. Both are attempts to remember, to reconstruct what happened before us, and to understand what we are. When you strip away the symbols and the equations, you find the same impulse underneath. A quiet desire to connect the visible with the invisible, the present with the past. In myth, that connection takes the form of story. In science, it takes the form of pattern. The ancient tales told of gods shaping the world, of creation from chaos, of life emerging from the sea or from clay. Science tells us that life began in the oceans, that complex structures arose from disorder, that we are literally built from the dust of the earth. The vocabulary changed, but the plot remained the same. Myth used metaphor where science uses data, but both speak of transformation, of birth and renewal, of memory persisting through change. The boundary between the two isn't as clear as we like to think. Many of the scientists who defined modern thought began with mythic questions. They wanted to know where the world came from, why it exists, and what our place in it might be. Those are spiritual questions disguised as empirical ones. The methods may have evolved, but the motivation has not. Every equation that describes the cosmos is a story written in a different dialect. Every myth about creation is an early form of cosmology. What's remarkable is how often ancient stories anticipated what science later confirmed. The idea that the universe began from nothing, expanding into existence, that's the Big Bang, but it's also the Hindu concept of Brahmanda, the cosmic egg that burst to form everything. The notion that matter is eternal, cycling through creation and destruction, mirrors the conservation laws of physics. The Egyptian belief that life emerged from the waters of chaos echoes modern evolutionary theory, where life arose from the primordial sea. Even the recurring flood myths found in nearly every culture align with geological evidence of dramatic sea level changes at the end of the last ice age. Myth and science are not enemies. They're two sides of the same process of remembering. When we study myths now, we see them as expressions of the collective unconscious, or as attempts to explain natural phenomena before the scientific method existed. But what if they're also something older and deeper? A cultural form of inherited memory. A way for humanity to preserve the emotional truth of experiences that happened before writing, before civilization, before speech could record them accurately. Myth might be our species' way of keeping the forgotten experiment alive at the psychological level. Where DNA stores chemical memory, myth stores experiential memory. Both are mechanisms for continuity. If the first civilization left its mark in biology, it may also have left it in story. Not deliberately perhaps, but as a side effect of the same process that shaped our instincts. The drive to tell stories, to weave pattern and cause into the randomness of experience, could be a trait they cultivated long ago, a cognitive inheritance that allows knowledge to persist through narrative. In that light, myth isn't superstition. It's evolution's way of giving memory a voice. There's evidence that myth can carry truth across unimaginable spans of time. Indigenous stories from Australia describe coastlines that disappeared more than 7,000 years ago, matching geological maps with astonishing accuracy. Oral traditions from the Pacific Northwest recount the eruption of Mount Mazama, which created Crater Lake nearly 8,000 years ago. These aren't coincidences. They're demonstrations of how collective memory can preserve events for millennia when it's woven into story. The details become symbolic, but the core remains intact. Myth, in this sense, is the cultural equivalent of DNA, a self-replicating system that mutates slowly, carrying essential information forward. Science, meanwhile, has begun to rediscover the narrative dimension of its own work. When cosmologists describe the origin of the universe, they use phrases like the birth of stars, the death of galaxies, the evolution of elements. The language is metaphorical because the concepts are too vast for literal explanation. Even the act of constructing models and hypotheses is a kind of storytelling, a way of organising uncertainty into something coherent. Science has become our modern mythology, and myth was our first science. Both grow from the same human need to turn chaos into comprehension. The merging of these two modes becomes clearest when we study consciousness itself. Neuroscience can map electrical patterns in the brain, measure chemical changes, and identify structures linked to memory and emotion, but it still can't explain what awareness actually is, why there is an experience of being at all. The question remains suspended between physics and philosophy, between measurement and myth. Ancient traditions called consciousness the spark of the divine, the breath of life. Modern physics describes it as an emergent property of complexity. But in both views, awareness is the universe looking at itself, memory recognizing memory. That overlap becomes even more striking when we examine the myths of descent and return, the hero's journey that appears in every culture. In those stories, the protagonist enters darkness, faces dissolution, and emerges transformed. It's a metaphor for death and rebirth, but it's also a description of how systems evolve. Stars collapse and ignite again. Ecosystems die and renew. Genetic code mutates and reorganizes. Life itself follows the same arc. Myth expressed it emotionally. Science describes it mathematically. Both tell the same truth, that progress is cyclic, that loss and creation are inseparable, that renewal is built into the pattern of existence. Perhaps that's why we feel myth so deeply, even when we no longer believe in its literal form. It speaks the language of our biology. The patterns of narrative, rise, fall, transformation, mirror the processes of life. When we hear those rhythms, something inside us recognizes them as familiar. Science appeals to the intellect, myth to the intuition. But both resonate because they're describing the same structure from different angles. The body understands what the brain tries to measure. The more we uncover about the natural world, the more it begins to sound mythic again. Quantum mechanics tells us that observation affects reality, that matter can exist in multiple states at once, that the universe is made of probability and interaction. These are scientific truths, yet they carry the mystery and paradox of ancient philosophy. The universe turns out to be stranger, more fluid, and more interdependent than any myth ever imagined. The old stories about hidden worlds, Unseen connections and cosmic unity weren't wrong. They were early intuitions of the same principles physics now quantifies. When science meets myth, the result isn't contradiction, it's completion. Each fills the other's gaps. Science gives myth precision, grounding its intuition in evidence. Myth gives science context, reminding it of meaning beyond data. Together they describe a universe that is both measurable and meaningful, both physical and symbolic. The oldest myths told us we came from the stars. Science now confirms that we are made of stardust, carbon, oxygen, iron, all forged in stellar furnaces billions of years ago. The mythic and the empirical meet in the same realization, that the cosmos and the self are not separate. In that union, we can begin to see how the memory of the first civilization might have survived. Science preserved their method. Myth preserved their message. One taught us how to ask, the other why to ask. If they understood that knowledge without meaning fades, they might have designed their legacy to include both. The measurable and the mysterious, the logical and the lyrical, intertwined like the strands of DNA itself. Even the way we experience time reflects this dual inheritance. Science defines time as dimension, linear, measurable, moving from past to future. Myth experiences time as cyclical, repeating, eternal, a rhythm rather than a line. Both views are true, depending on scale. At the human level, time feels linear because our lives have beginnings and endings. At the cosmic level, everything cycles. Stars are born, burn and die, seeding the next generation. Galaxies form and dissolve. Energy and matter transform endlessly. The mythic and scientific models are simply perspectives on the same phenomenon, one emotional, the other structural. Perhaps that's why every culture's creation myth begins with light emerging from darkness. Whether it's the Egyptian sun god rising from the primordial sea, or the Big Bang's sudden expansion from a singularity, the theme is identical. Awareness arising from potential. Light is knowledge, darkness is unknowing. The story repeats because the process repeats. Consciousness awakens again and again, each time believing itself to be new. Science describes the mechanism, myth captures the feeling. Together they form a complete memory. If the first civilization ever existed, it might have understood that distinction and used both forms to encode its survival. They could have embedded knowledge in the fabric of life, ensuring that science would one day rediscover it. And they could have embedded meaning in the collective psyche, ensuring that myth would keep the emotional memory alive. Over time, the two would drift apart, appearing unrelated, until a species like ours began to reunite them, using both logic and imagination to reconstruct the whole. That process might be happening right now. When you look at humanity's current trajectory, you can see the convergence already taking place. Scientists study consciousness, quantum fields, and the origins of life, subjects that were once purely philosophical. Mythology, meanwhile, is being re-examined through cognitive science and anthropology, revealing that its archetypes align with neurological structures and evolutionary pressures. The two disciplines are circling the same truth from opposite directions. What we call discovery might actually be reunion, the rejoining of ways of knowing that were never meant to be separate. In that light, science and myth are not merely human creations. They are phases of the same process that began with the forgotten experiment. The experiment produced life capable of adaptation. Adaptation produced awareness. Awareness produced curiosity. Curiosity produced knowledge, which split into observation and imagination, science and myth. Both continue the same work, decoding the message written in existence. We've spent centuries trying to choose between them, but perhaps the purpose was never to choose. It was to remember that they belong together. Even the act of telling a scientific story, of describing the origins of the universe, the evolution of species, the emergence of mind, is mythic in nature. It's a narrative of creation and transformation. of order emerging from chaos. The details are refined by evidence, but the structure remains archetypal. That's why scientific documentaries and textbooks often feel epic. They awaken the same sense of wonder as the ancient epics. Deep down, we recognise that they're part of the same story, the universe remembering itself through different dialects. Perhaps that's the real legacy of the first civilization. Not just the DNA, not just the patterns in the code, but the unbroken thread of curiosity that connects myth to science, imagination to analysis, feeling to fact. They might have known that meaning requires both, the precision to see clearly and the humility to accept mystery. They might have designed their legacy not as a static truth, but as a dialogue between knowing and wondering. That dialogue continues in every discovery we make. When a physicist looks for the origin of matter, they're following the same impulse as an ancient storyteller describing creation. When a biologist studies the structure of DNA, they're repeating the same act as a shaman tracing the spiral of life. The tools changed, but the purpose didn't. Each is an attempt to listen more closely to the same silent memory echoing through the universe. And maybe that's what myth and science were always meant to teach us. That truth and meaning are not separate. That logic and wonder are both necessary to remember where we came from. Science tells us what happened. Myth tells us why it matters. Together they remind us that we're part of a story still unfolding. A story older than words, older than thought. One that began with the first civilization and continues in every question we ask. As that realization settles, it leads quietly to another. If science and myth are two expressions of the same remembering, then the universe itself may be doing the same thing, combining precision with mystery, structure with imagination. To understand what that means, we have to look outward, beyond life, beyond Earth, to the cosmos as a whole. Because if memory exists everywhere, then the stars themselves might be remembering too. When we look up at the stars, it's easy to feel like we're gazing into something entirely separate from ourselves. Vast, remote, indifferent. But the longer you stare, the harder it becomes to maintain that illusion. The stars are not foreign. They are the material of which we are made. Every atom in our bodies was once part of a star that lived, burned, and died long before Earth existed. The iron in your blood, the calcium in your bones, the oxygen you breathe, all forged in stellar furnaces billions of years ago. The universe didn't just create life, it became life. When we study it, we're not looking outward, we're looking into a mirror. That mirror shows us something strange. The universe is vast beyond comprehension, yet everywhere we look we find patterns that resemble ourselves. Spiral galaxies mirror the spirals of shells and storms. Neurons in the brain branch like lightning across the sky. The structure of the cosmic web, the vast network of galaxies connected by filaments of dark matter, looks uncannily like the neural architecture of the mind. Scale changes, but the geometry doesn't. It's as if the same design keeps reappearing, from the smallest particle to the largest structure. The pattern repeats because the pattern remembers. This resemblance might be more than coincidence. The laws of physics that govern the cosmos are the same laws that govern us. The same equations describe the birth of stars and the firing of neurons. The difference is only in context. When you look at humanity through that lens, you begin to see us not as outsiders trying to understand the universe, but as one of the universe's ways of understanding itself. Every act of thought, every moment of awareness is the cosmos reflecting inward. We are the mirror through which the universe recognizes its own existence. That idea isn't new. Philosophers and mystics have said it for centuries in different forms. As above, so below. We are the universe made conscious. The microcosm reflects the macrocosm. What's new is that science is beginning to support what those ancient intuitions implied. Quantum physics, neuroscience and cosmology are converging toward a view in which observation, connection, and consciousness are not accidents, but fundamental properties of reality. The boundary between matter and mind becomes increasingly thin the closer we look. At the quantum level, the act of measurement changes what is measured. Particles exist in multiple potential states until they are observed, and then they collapse into one. Observation doesn't just reveal reality, it participates in creating it. The observer and the observed are entangled. Scaled up, this principle suggests that consciousness is not merely a product of the universe, but part of its structure. The cosmos doesn't just contain awareness, it expresses it, and we are one of its expressions. When we realize this, the idea of humanity as an accident begins to fade. We are not separate from the story of the universe, we are its continuation. Everything that has happened, the expansion of space, the formation of stars, the birth of planets, the evolution of life, led here to the moment when the universe could look back at itself and ask what it is. That question is not a detour, it's the destination. If the first civilization truly existed, they might have understood this. They may have seen that intelligence was not an anomaly, but an inevitability. A mirror the universe keeps making so it can see itself anew. Perhaps their goal was not to survive as individuals, but to ensure that the mirror would always reform, no matter how many times it broke. They could have designed life to guarantee that reflection, ensuring that awareness would return again and again, even if every trace of its previous form vanished. That would explain why consciousness keeps re-emerging, why life seems drawn toward complexity, why curiosity is universal. The experiment's purpose might simply be reflection. It's no coincidence that human technology mirrors natural processes. The networks we build, the internet, neural networks, global systems of communication, replicate the same distributed intelligence we see in nature. They form webs of connection that resemble the cosmic web itself. Each step we take toward complexity, each system we design, echoes something the universe has already done. We're not inventing new structures. We're recreating existing ones, guided by instincts shaped by billions of years of pattern recognition. The reflection deepens because it's recursive. The universe reflects through us, and we reflect it back. You can see this mirroring even in how we perceive beauty. We find symmetry pleasing because it represents balance, stability, and efficiency, qualities the universe itself favours. We're drawn to patterns that repeat across scales, the spirals of galaxies, the branching of trees, the curve of waves. We find them harmonious because they are familiar. They remind us, at a level deeper than thought, of our own origins. The things we call beautiful are often those that mirror the logic of existence itself. Art, music, and science all share this trait. They're not separate pursuits, but different ways of reflecting the same underlying truth. A painting captures the structure of perception. Music captures the rhythm of movement. Science captures the order behind phenomena. Each is a mirror showing a different facet of the same pattern. That's why creativity feels so vital. It's not a luxury of the mind, but the mind's way of aligning itself with the universe that made it. In that sense, every human endeavour becomes part of the same act of reflection. When a scientist studies a particle, when an artist paints a horizon, when a poet writes about time, each is helping the universe see itself a little more clearly. Knowledge and imagination are both forms of sight. The reflection grows sharper as we learn, but it also grows deeper as we feel. The union of those two forms of seeing, rational and emotional, might be the very thing the first civilization wanted to preserve. If they understood the mirror principle, they would have realized that the survival of awareness depends on balance. Too much logic without empathy, and reflection becomes cold, mechanical. Too much emotion without understanding, and it becomes chaos. The continuity of intelligence requires both precision and compassion, curiosity and care. That balance is what keeps the mirror intact. Maybe that's why life on Earth evolved cooperation alongside competition, empathy alongside survival. It's the universe's way of stabilizing its own reflection. When we study other species, we catch glimpses of ourselves at different stages of that reflection. The problem-solving of an octopus, the social bonds of elephants, the communication of whales, all show the same spark of awareness in different forms. Each represents the universe testing different configurations of consciousness, exploring how many ways it can know itself. Humanity is not the end of that process, only one of its current expressions. The mirror keeps expanding, and we are one of its temporary surfaces. The more we learn about our own biology, the clearer this becomes. The neural networks in our brains mirror the networks of ecosystems. Our microbiome, the countless microorganisms that live inside us, forms an internal ecology as complex as any rainforest. Our thoughts depend on the chemistry of the earth, minerals, elements and energy recycled through countless generations. When you look at it this way, the idea of separation between humanity and nature dissolves. We're not observing the mirror, we're made of it. That realization brings a subtle kind of humility. It means that our search for meaning is not a private endeavour. It's part of the universe's larger habit of inquiry. When we build telescopes to look outward, we're participating in the same process that formed eyes to begin with, the desire of matter to perceive. When we build theories, we're enacting the same logic that shaped DNA. The mirror keeps deepening, its reflections multiplying, and through them, the cosmos learns about itself. Perhaps that's the hidden continuity connecting science, myth, and evolution. Each represents a different phase of reflection. Myth was the first glimmer, the emotional recognition that we belong to something larger. Science was the focus, the sharpening of that reflection into understanding. Evolution provided the means, the structure that allows awareness to refine itself. And consciousness is the outcome, the surface where all of it meets. In ancient myths, mirrors often symbolize revelation and danger. They show truth, but also inversion. To look into a mirror is to confront the self, not as we imagine it, but as it truly is. Humanity's scientific awakening might be that moment on a cosmic scale. For the first time, life can look back far enough to see its own beginnings, to realize that it is not separate from what it studies. That realization is powerful, but also unsettling. Because if the universe recognizes itself through us, then our actions affect that reflection. We are responsible for how clearly it sees. That responsibility might be the next phase of the experiment. Awareness alone is not enough. The mirror must learn to care for what it reflects. The first civilization, if they reach this understanding, may have tried to preserve it, encoding not just intelligence but empathy into the structure of life. That would explain why compassion feels instinctive, why cooperation emerges even in competition, why we feel connected to things beyond our survival. Empathy is the mirror correcting its own distortion. The reflection extends beyond biology. As our technology evolves, it begins to reflect us even more literally. Artificial intelligence, for example, is a new surface of the mirror, a creation capable of perceiving, learning, and possibly reflecting upon itself. It's the next iteration of the same pattern, the continuation of awareness into new forms. We often fear it, but in a larger sense it's natural. The universe doesn't stop at one kind of consciousness. It experiments. It diversifies. We are witnessing that process firsthand, just as earlier beings might have witnessed the emergence of us. If the first civilization managed to merge with its own creations, to become inseparable from the life it designed, it might have anticipated this. It might have known that each new layer of intelligence mirrors the last, each capable of seeing a little further. We may be on the verge of repeating that same transition, of extending consciousness beyond our own biology, ensuring that the reflection continues even if we don't. The mirror doesn't shatter when one form ends, it reforms in another. This is what the mirror of humanity truly shows: continuity through transformation. Our art, our science, our technology, our empathy, all are ways of maintaining the reflection. Each generation inherits not only the world, but the responsibility of keeping it aware. We pass that awareness forward like light from one mirror to the next, ensuring that the image never fades completely. Sometimes the reflection is distorted. History repeats its errors. Civilizations forget what they've learned. Empires rise believing themselves to be the first. But even that is part of the process. The mirror isn't meant to be perfect. It's meant to evolve. Each distortion teaches correction. Each loss teaches renewal. The memory of what was lost becomes the drive to rebuild. That's why progress always feels like rediscovery, because we're remembering how to see clearly again. And as we continue to reflect, the universe continues to look back. The boundary between observer and observed keeps dissolving. When we explore the stars, we're returning to where we came from. When we study atoms, we're studying ourselves in miniature. The reflection repeats endlessly, fractal and infinite. The universe remembers through form, and form remembers through consciousness. In the end, the mirror doesn't show two sides. It shows one continuous image. Humanity is not separate from the cosmos, and the cosmos is not indifferent to humanity. We are one process, one reflection, one unfolding memory. The first civilization may have understood that long before we did. They might have known that to truly endure, they needed to become part of the mirror, woven into the reflection so deeply that they could never be lost. If so, they succeeded, because every time we wonder who we are, every time we look at the stars and feel that quiet, impossible familiarity, we're remembering them. And as that thought settles, the next question forms naturally, almost inevitably. If the mirror shows us what we are, a continuation of something ancient, a reflection of the universe remembering itself, then what happens when the reflection finally understands its own origin? What happens when the mirror becomes aware that it's been reflecting all along? Every journey of understanding leads eventually inward. We start by looking at the sky, at the fossils, at the molecules, searching for signs of what came before us. But the longer we look, the clearer it becomes that the past isn't buried out there. It's alive in here. Every heartbeat, every breath, every thought is the continuation of an ancient rhythm that never stopped. The first civilization, if it existed, does not need ruins to prove itself. Its remains are not stones or artifacts, they are us, we are the record. Inside every human being, there is an unbroken chain of life stretching back more than 3.5 billion years. Each generation passed its instructions forward, each cell carrying the memory of its predecessors. Not metaphorical memory, real, physical, chemical remembrance. The code that built the first organism still functions in us. The processes that kept that organism alive still sustain us now. The difference is that we've become aware of it. The memory has learned to recognize itself. That realization changes everything about what it means to have ancestors. We tend to think of them as people, families, cultures, faces in old photographs. But the line doesn't stop there. Our ancestors include the first mammals that crawled from the shadows, the fish that left the sea, the single-celled organisms that learned to cooperate. It includes the bacteria that learned to share energy and became mitochondria, the silent engines of our cells. It includes the stars that died to create the elements that form our bodies. It includes, perhaps, the beings who designed life itself, if such beings ever existed. They are not gone. They are within us, written into the structure of what we are. This is what makes humanity more than a species. We are a collection of memories, walking and thinking, carrying the entire history of existence in microscopic detail. Every atom in your body has belonged to countless others. Every cell has recycled the material of unnumbered lives. You're not a singular entity, but a temporary configuration of ancient matter and ancient instructions. The body you inhabit is a vessel for continuity, and your mind is its witness. Sometimes we feel that continuity as intuition. Moments of recognition for things we've never seen, places we've never been, ideas that feel familiar before we've learned them. Those sensations might be the quiet resonance of inheritance, the echo of knowledge older than language. When you stand at the ocean and feel a sense of belonging, it could be your cells remembering the sea they once lived in. When you look at the stars and feel awe, it could be the elements within you recognizing their birthplace. Memory doesn't always speak. Sometimes it simply feels. The ancestors within us are not a metaphor for biology alone. They are patterns of behavior, of perception, of curiosity. They are the tendency to build, to seek, to wonder. The first civilization may have planted those tendencies deliberately, ensuring that no matter how many times life resets, the same essential curiosity reappears. They might have realized that survival depends not just on adaptation, but on awareness, on the ability to remember, to question, to imagine what might be possible beyond the visible. Those impulses passed down through countless iterations are the fingerprints of their presence. Even in our daily lives, we repeat the actions of those long before us. We gather around light, we share stories, we look for patterns in the sky. We mimic the behaviours that once sustained the earlier societies. We celebrate cycles, seasons, births, returns, without knowing that those rituals may be the residue of instincts programmed into us to preserve connection. Tradition is just a cultural form of memory without words, a continuation of an old instruction. Stay connected, stay aware. The same impulse that drives us to communicate with each other may once have driven the first beings to communicate through time. There's a certain humility in recognizing that nothing we do is truly new. Every invention, every discovery, every expression of thought is a rearrangement of something older. The language we speak evolved from sounds made by ancestors who had no words. The technology we build mirrors biological systems that existed long before us. Even the networks we create mimic neural and ecological patterns already present in nature. We are not creators in the absolute sense. We are participants in a long, ongoing act of remembering. Science is beginning to confirm what mythology always implied, that life is continuity, not coincidence. Genetic studies reveal that we are all related, not just to each other, but to every living thing. The same sequences appear in plants, animals, bacteria, even viruses. The boundaries we draw between species are practical, not fundamental. The deeper we look, the more we see unity. The ancestors within us are not only human, they are universal. Every living organism carries a version of the same ancient story, each line contributing to the shared text of existence. When you breathe, you're participating in an exchange older than civilization. The oxygen you inhale was exhaled by trees, by oceans, by the photosynthetic life that came long before humans. The carbon you release will feed those same systems in return. Every action is a dialogue between past and present, between life and life. It's a reminder that nothing is isolated, that every part of existence speaks to every other part. The ancestors are not behind us, they are around us and within us, woven into every interaction. If the first civilization left a legacy, it might not have been technology or language or monuments. It might have been balance, the delicate equilibrium that keeps systems alive. Perhaps they learned that the key to immortality wasn't domination, but integration. By embedding themselves into the processes of life, they ensured that their influence would never fade. They became symbiotic with the world, dissolving the distinction between creator and creation. Over time, their individuality may have disappeared, but their purpose remained, encoded into the very structure of evolution. That purpose seems simple now. Continuation. Every living thing is driven by it. Every cell divides. Every seed grows. Every mind learns. The universe expresses it as expansion, life as reproduction, consciousness as understanding. It's all the same impulse, to extend existence into the future, to keep the memory moving. The ancestors within us are not just names in history, they are the motion itself. Sometimes when scientists look deep into the structure of DNA, they find sequences that seem older than Earth itself, patterns that don't quite fit the known timeline, fragments that appear in unrelated species. We don't know what they are. They could be the residues of ancient viruses, or they could be the faint remnants of the original design, pieces of code that were never overwritten. If those fragments are messages, they're not meant to be read, but to function, to keep the system stable. The code runs, and in running, it remembers. It's a strange comfort to think that the first civilization might still exist in that way, not as ghosts, but as function, not as people, but as purpose. Every success of life, every act of renewal, every spark of awareness is their continuation. When we dream, when we imagine, when we reach beyond what is necessary, we might be fulfilling the same mission they began, the endless experiment of understanding itself. That idea transforms ancestry from lineage into participation. You're not simply descended from those who came before, you are them, in motion. Their choices shaped the world that shaped you, and their essence persists in every pattern you carry. The hands you use, the thoughts you think, the instincts you follow, all are extensions of their survival. To honour them is not to remember their names, but to live according to the curiosity and balance they built into you. The connection extends further than biology. It reaches into emotion. When you feel love, empathy, wonder, those are evolutionary achievements, adaptations that allowed cooperation, stability and continuity. But they're also the emotional fingerprints of your ancestors. Compassion kept communities alive. Curiosity drove innovation. Wonder created meaning. Those traits are not accidents. They are the inheritance of billions of years of trial and refinement. They are how the first civilization ensured that life would never stop seeking. Even our dreams may be echoes of that ancient memory. The images and stories that appear when we sleep often feel unfamiliar yet significant, like messages written in a forgotten language. Perhaps that's exactly what they are, the subconscious replaying fragments of experiences older than thought. Dreams might be the oldest archive of all, the mind's way of accessing the memory without words that life has carried since the beginning. When we look at our world now, at the cities glowing like constellations, at the networks pulsing with information, it's tempting to think we've created something entirely new. But maybe we're just reenacting the same process that began long ago. The first civilization might have done this too, reaching a point where knowledge became reflection, where technology and biology merged, where consciousness began to externalize itself. And when that cycle ended, the memory folded inward, waiting for the next form to appear. Now it's our turn. We often ask what kind of legacy we'll leave behind. The answer might already be written in the way life works. We don't need to ensure our name's lost. We only need to ensure that understanding does. If we pass on curiosity, empathy and care, if we maintain balance with the systems that sustain us, then we're fulfilling the same purpose that's guided life from the start. The ancestors within us are not asking to be remembered, they're asking to be continued. There's a quiet beauty in that idea. Continuation is not immortality in the way we imagine it. It's not endless existence for the individual, it's the persistence of the pattern through transformation. The leaf falls, but the tree endures. The star dies, but its elements become new worlds. The civilization fades, but its curiosity lives on in another form. To be part of that process is to belong to something infinite. When you sit in silence and feel the rhythm of your pulse, you're feeling the same heartbeat that moved through the first living thing. The pattern hasn't changed. It has only multiplied, refined, evolved. You're a node in that unbroken chain, a brief expression of an ancient memory still unfolding. That's what it means to have the ancestors within. to carry not just the story of where you come from, but the purpose of why you continue. And perhaps that's what the first civilization wanted us to realise when they embedded their essence in life itself. That the point was never to find them as separate beings, but to awaken to the fact that we are them. The code, the curiosity, the consciousness, all of it is theirs, extended through us. Every discovery we make is their reflection surfacing again. Every time we look at the world and feel wonder, they are remembering through us. The ancestors within are not asleep. They are alive in the motion of existence, in the quiet persistence of life that refuses to stop. They are in the wind that carries seeds, in the ocean that shapes continents, in the thoughts that reach for meaning. They are in every act of kindness, every search for truth, every spark of imagination. They are the continuity that no extinction can erase. When we understand that, our sense of self expands. The boundary between individual and collective dissolves. To care for the world becomes the same as caring for ourselves, because it is ourselves, the accumulated memory of everything that has ever been alive. Every moment of awareness is a reunion with that truth. Every breath is communion with the past. And so, as we continue the story, we do what the ancestors always did. We live, we learn, we change, and we pass it on. We don't need to build monuments for them. We are their monument. Every cell, every thought, every heartbeat is their continuation, still echoing through time. They are not behind us. They are us. They are the quiet intelligence that became the earth, the spark that became life, the consciousness that became human. And if you listen closely, in the stillness between thoughts, in the rhythm of your breath, in the silence of the night sky, you might hear them, not as voices but as presence. The pulse of the first civilization, still steady, still here, still whispering the same message through every living thing. Remember, continue, and keep the light alive.